Operation Aurora, the hack that changed everything. Part 1. The Silent Intrusion. Picture this. It's mid-December 2009. Snow is falling across Mountain View, California, and inside the sprawling Google campus, thousands of the world's brightest engineers are wrapping up another year of innovation. The company that had revolutionized search, that had made to Google a verb in the global lexicon, was riding high. Gmail had hundreds of millions of users. Chrome was gaining ground against Internet Explorer. Android phones were starting to appear everywhere. Google wasn't just a tech company anymore. It was a force of nature, a digital empire that touched nearly every corner of the Internet. But somewhere deep in Google's network infrastructure, something was terribly wrong. In the labyrinth of servers and data centers that powered the search giant's operations, an unwelcome presence had taken root. Malicious code was moving through the system like a predator stalking its prey, patient and deliberate. It wasn't smashing through firewalls or triggering alarms. It was slipping through security layers with a sophistication that suggested this wasn't the work of common criminals or script kiddies looking to make a quick buck. This was something else entirely. The attackers had been inside for weeks, maybe longer. They'd compromised employee workstations through carefully crafted spear phishing emails so convincing that even security-conscious engineers had been fooled. Once inside, they'd exploited a vulnerability in Microsoft Internet Explorer that Microsoft itself knew about but hadn't patched, a so-called zero-day flaw that gave the intruders unfettered access to infected machines. From there, they'd moved laterally through Google's network, searching, probing, looking for specific targets. And they found them. Source code repositories containing the crown jewels of Google's intellectual property. Systems managing Gmail accounts of human rights activists in China. Access to potentially thousands of accounts, communications, and the digital trails of people who dared to speak out against one of the world's most powerful governments. This wasn't ransomware. There were no demands, no encrypted files, no Bitcoin wallets waiting for payment. This was pure espionage, conducted with the resources and patience of a nation-state actor. What Google's security team didn't yet know was that they weren't alone. At least 33 other companies across multiple sectors were experiencing the same thing. Adobe Systems, the makers of Photoshop and Acrobat Reader, had been breached. So had Juniper Networks, makers of critical networking equipment. Yahoo was compromised. Symantec, ironically a security company, had been infiltrated. Defense contractors like Northrop Grumman were under attack. Financial giants like Morgan Stanley had intruders in their networks. Even chemical companies like Dow Chemical weren't spared. This was Operation Aurora, though nobody called it that yet. The name would come later, discovered in the malware's own code, a breadcrumb left by attackers who never imagined their operation would become one of the most analyzed cyber attacks in history. Aurora would become a watershed moment, the point where the comfortable assumption that commercial companies were safe from nation-state attacks evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. The story of Operation Aurora is not just about one hack or one company. It's about the collision of technology, politics, human rights, and espionage in an interconnected world where the rules are still being written. It's about how a search engine company found itself in a geopolitical standoff with the world's most populous nation. It's about source code flowing out of supposedly secure networks, about human rights activists whose private communications became targets, about backdoors built for legitimate law enforcement being exploited by foreign intelligence services. Most importantly, Operation Aurora is about the moment when everyone realized the game had fundamentally changed. The perimeter-based security model, the idea that you could build a high wall around your network and everything inside could be trusted, was dead. The castle and moat approach to cybersecurity had failed spectacularly, and it failed against an adversary who had the time, resources, and technical sophistication to achieve objectives that went far beyond financial gain. This is the story of how Google, Adobe, and dozens of tech giants were quietly infiltrated in one of the most sophisticated cyber-espionage campaigns ever conducted. No ransom, no noise, just intellectual property flowing out of networks while companies went about their daily business, unaware that hostile actors were reading their most sensitive data and stealing the source code that represented years of development work and millions of dollars in investment. Part 2. The Road to Confrontation, Google's China Gambit. To understand Operation Aurora, you have to understand the complicated, fraught, and ultimately doomed relationship between Google and the People's Republic of China. It's a relationship that began with optimism, became mired in compromise, and ended in one of the most dramatic corporate exits in tech history. The year was 2006, and Google was facing a decision that would define its future. China represented an enormous opportunity. With over 1 billion people and an internet population growing at breathtaking speed, the Chinese market was simply too big to ignore. Every major tech company wanted in. Microsoft had entered the market. Yahoo had already established a significant presence. If Google didn't move, it risked being left behind in what many saw as the most important growth market of the 21st century. But there was a problem, and it was a big one. The Chinese government maintained strict control over the internet within its borders through a sophisticated system of censorship known colloquially as the Great Firewall. Any company that wanted to operate in China had to play by Beijing's rules, and those rules were very clear. Censor content that the government deemed sensitive. No information about the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989. No content about Tibetan independence. No coverage of the Falun Gong spiritual movement. No access to websites critical of the Communist Party leadership. For Google, a company whose mission statement proclaimed it wanted to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible, this created a fundamental contradiction. The founders, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, had built Google on principles of open information access. The company's famous motto was "Don't be evil," a phrase that had become synonymous with Google's brand identity. How could they reconcile that with censorship? The decision Google made was controversial from the moment it was announced. They would launch Google.cn, a Chinese version of their search engine that complied with government censorship requirements. Search for Tiananmen Square on Google.cn and you'd get images of tourists posing in front of the Gate of Heavenly Peace, the historical landmark. Search for the same term on Google.com and you'd find documentation of the 1989 protests and the violent crackdown that killed hundreds, possibly thousands of people. Google justified this compromise with a utilitarian argument. It was better to provide limited access to information than no access at all. A censored Google was still more open than Baidu, the leading Chinese search engine, which implemented government censorship with enthusiasm rather than reluctance. The criticism was immediate and fierce. Human rights organizations denounced Google for capitulating to an authoritarian regime. Members of Congress questioned Google executives. Protesters called for boycotts. The company that had positioned itself as a force for openness and transparency was now actively participating in information control. Sergey Brin, who had experienced life in the Soviet Union before his family emigrated when he was a child, was particularly troubled by the decision, but the business case seemed overwhelming. For a few years, it worked, sort of. Google China gained market share, though it never managed to overtake Baidu. The censorship gnawed at people within Google who had joined the company precisely because they believed in its mission of universal information access. But business was business, and China was too important to walk away from. Then the relationship started to fray. In 2008, Tibet erupted in protests against Chinese rule, and Beijing cracked down hard. YouTube, which Google had acquired in 2006, became filled with footage of Chinese security forces beating Tibetan protesters. The Chinese government's response was swift. They blocked access to YouTube entirely. Google services were becoming intermittently unavailable from mainland China. The government was tightening its grip on information, and Google found itself caught in the middle. In 2009, the situation deteriorated further. The Chinese government wasn't just asking Google to censor search results anymore. They were demanding that Google block specific websites, many of them dealing with sexual content, but others focused on political issues. The demands kept coming, each one pushing Google further from its principles. The China Illegal Information Reporting Center, a government agency, was sending lists of sites to block. Google was being turned into an enforcement arm of the censorship apparatus. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. Chinese human rights activists who used Gmail for their communications were reporting strange activity on their accounts. People would receive messages that looked like they came from colleagues or friends, asking them to click on links or download attachments. The emails were so well crafted that many people clicked without thinking. What they didn't know was that these messages were part of a sophisticated social engineering campaign designed to compromise their computers and steal their communications. Google's relationship with China had become untenable, but the final break would require a catalyst, something so egregious that even the allure of the Chinese market couldn't justify staying. That catalyst was coming, and it was already underway. While Google debated censorship policy and market strategy, attackers were busy worming their way deep into the company's networks, hunting for source code and the private communications of the very activists that Google claimed to care about. The compromises Google had made to enter China were about to come back to haunt them in ways nobody could have anticipated. The backdoors they'd built into Gmail to comply with U.S. law enforcement wiretap orders were about to be exploited by a foreign intelligence service. The source code repositories that powered their services were about to be accessed by attackers who could use that information to find new vulnerabilities or build competing services. The human rights activists whose Gmail accounts represented one of the few secure communication channels available were about to be exposed. Operation Aurora would force Google to confront a fundamental question. What was the company willing to sacrifice for access to the Chinese market? How much compromise was too much? At what point did the cost of doing business in China outweigh the benefits? The answers to those questions would reshape Google's future and send shockwaves through the tech industry. But first, the attack had to be discovered, analyzed, and understood. Part 3. The Attack Vector: How They Got In. Understanding how Operation Aurora succeeded requires understanding a perfect storm of technical vulnerabilities, human psychology, and patient tradecraft. This wasn't a smash-and-grab operation. The attackers weren't spray-and-pray hackers throwing exploits at random targets hoping something would stick. This was targeted, methodical, and executed with a level of sophistication that suggested significant resources and expertise. It started with reconnaissance. The attackers needed to identify specific individuals within their target organizations who had access to the systems they wanted to reach. These weren't random employees. The attackers were looking for software developers, engineers, and administrators who had legitimate access to source code repositories and sensitive systems. They were profiling their targets, understanding their roles, their communications patterns, their professional networks. This kind of intelligence gathering takes time and resources. You need to understand the organizational structure of your target, who reports to whom, who has elevated privileges, who works on what projects. Once they'd identified their targets, the attackers crafted spear-phishing emails with extraordinary attention to detail. These weren't the crude, "you've won the lottery" scams that fill everyone's spam folders. These were personalized messages that appeared to come from colleagues, friends, or professional contacts. The emails referenced real projects, used appropriate professional language, and contained links or attachments that seemed completely legitimate in context. An engineer at Google might receive a message that appeared to come from a colleague in another department, asking them to review a document related to a project they were actually working on. The email address looked right at first glance. The sender's name was correct. The message contained enough contextual detail to seem authentic. So the engineer clicked the link, and that simple action initiated a chain of events that would ultimately expose one of the most significant corporate cyber attacks in history. What happened next involved technical exploitation that revealed deep knowledge of how modern software works and where its weak points lie. The links in these spear phishing emails directed victims to websites that had been specially prepared for the attack. These weren't obvious malware distribution sites that would trigger security warnings. The attackers had compromised legitimate websites, injecting malicious code into pages that victims might visit in the normal course of their work. This technique, sometimes called a watering hole attack, is particularly insidious because it turns trusted resources into vectors of attack. When a victim visited one of these compromised websites using Internet Explorer, something devastating happened. The website contained JavaScript code specifically crafted to exploit a zero-day vulnerability in Microsoft's browser, a flaw identified as CV 2010-0249. This vulnerability existed in how Internet Explorer handled certain DOM operations, the document object model that represents how browsers interpret and interact with web pages. The exploit caused a memory corruption issue that allowed arbitrary code execution. Think about what that means in practical terms. By simply visiting a website, without downloading anything explicitly, without clicking yes on any security warnings, without doing anything that would normally seem risky, the victim's computer could be compromised. The malicious JavaScript would trigger the Internet Explorer vulnerability, which would then execute a series of commands that downloaded and installed the hijack Trojan onto the victim's system. The sophistication of this attack chain cannot be overstated. The attackers needed to discover or acquire knowledge of a zero-day vulnerability in one of the world's most widely used pieces of software. They needed to develop reliable exploit code that would work across different versions of Internet Explorer and Windows. They needed to package that exploit in a way that would evade detection by antivirus software and other security tools. And they needed to deliver it in a context that wouldn't raise suspicion. Here's where things get even more interesting and more troubling. Microsoft had known about this vulnerability since September 2009. A researcher named Peter Vrugdenhill had reported it to the company through their responsible disclosure program. Microsoft assessed the vulnerability, prioritized it for a future patch, but didn't treat it as an emergency requiring an immediate fix. This wasn't unusual. Software companies receive vulnerability reports constantly, and they have to make decisions about which ones represent immediate threats and which can wait for scheduled update cycles. The attackers knew about this vulnerability too, somehow. Whether they discovered it independently, acquired it from vulnerability researchers in the gray market, or obtained it through some other means remains unclear. What is clear is that they had working exploit code months before Microsoft released a patch. This is what makes zero-day vulnerabilities so valuable and so dangerous. The defender doesn't know they're vulnerable, the security software doesn't know what to look for, and users have no way to protect themselves even if they're doing everything right. Once the hijack malware was installed on a victim's computer, it got to work establishing persistence and command and control communications. The malware registered itself as a Windows service, ensuring it would run automatically every time the system started. It modified registry keys to maintain its presence even if the user tried to remove suspicious software. It even changed file timestamps to make the malicious files blend in with legitimate system files, a technique designed to evade forensic analysis. Hijack then established what appeared to be an SSL connection to command and control servers. To anyone monitoring network traffic, this looked like normal encrypted web traffic, the kind that happens thousands of times a day on corporate networks. But it wasn't normal at all. This was a backdoor, a secret channel through which the attackers could send commands and receive stolen data. The command and control infrastructure was sophisticated, using servers located in Illinois, Texas, and Taiwan. Some of these servers were running on stolen Rackspace customer accounts, adding another layer of obfuscation to the operation. From the beachhead of a compromised employee workstation, the attackers could begin exploring the corporate network. Modern networks aren't flat structures where every computer can talk to every other computer. They're segmented into zones with different trust levels and access controls. But once you're inside a trusted employee's workstation, many of those barriers become irrelevant. The employee's computer has legitimate credentials, legitimate access rights, legitimate reasons to communicate with various internal systems. The attackers moved laterally through the network, searching for specific targets. They weren't interested in everything. This wasn't data hoarding. They had objectives, and they pursued those objectives with focus and determination. They were looking for source code repositories, the centralized systems where companies store the intellectual property that powers their products and services. They were looking for systems that managed email accounts, specifically accounts belonging to Chinese human rights activists. And in Google's case, they were looking for something even more sensitive: the system that flagged accounts subject to law enforcement wiretap orders. The technical tradecraft on display in Operation Aurora represented a level of sophistication that shocked security professionals. This wasn't a smash-and-grab cybercrime. This was patient, methodical espionage conducted by adversaries who had significant resources, deep technical expertise, and clear strategic objectives. The attack combined social engineering, zero-day exploitation, sophisticated malware, careful operational security, and targeted intelligence gathering. Each element of the attack chain showed signs of professional execution. Years later, when security researchers analyzed the attack, they found evidence of lengthy planning and preparation. Some components of the hijack malware had compilation timestamps dating back to 2006, suggesting that parts of this toolkit had been in development for years. The attackers had built a reusable platform for intrusion, not just a one-off exploit. The source code for the malware showed signs of Chinese language documentation, another clue about its origins, though not definitive proof. The victims included some of the most security-conscious organizations in the world. Google, Adobe, Symantec, these weren't companies with primitive security programs. They had well-funded security teams. They deployed multiple layers of defensive technology. They trained their employees on security awareness. And yet the attack succeeded. That success forced a reckoning in the security industry about what was actually possible to defend against and what fundamental assumptions needed to be reconsidered. Part 4. The hijack malware, a technical deep dive. To truly grasp the sophistication of Operation Aurora, we need to pull apart the hijack Trojan like forensic investigators examining evidence at a crime scene. This was an off-the-shelf malware cobbled together from internet tutorials. This was custom-built spyware designed for a specific set of objectives, and its technical characteristics revealed a great deal about the expertise and resources of whoever created it. The malware arrived on victim systems as an executable file, typically downloaded by the exploit code after the Internet Explorer vulnerability had been triggered. The file sizes varied, but samples analyzed by McAfee and other security researchers were typically compact, designed to download quickly over standard internet connections. The attackers understood that larger files would take longer to transfer and would be more likely to trigger security monitoring that looked for unusual data transfers. When the Hydrack executable first ran, it performed several critical installation steps designed to ensure persistence and stealth. First, it created a copy of itself in the Windows temporary directory, often using a randomized file name that wouldn't appear suspicious if someone happened to browse that folder. In some variants, the malware named itself C_1758.nls, a deliberately obscure file name that looked like it could be a legitimate system file. The malware then focused on establishing persistence through the Windows service mechanism. Services are programs that run in the background on Windows systems, providing various functions that need to operate independently of whether a user is logged in. System services start automatically when Windows boots. They run with elevated privileges, and they're difficult for average users to detect or remove. Hydrack registered itself as a service with a name like RAS, followed by 4 random characters, another technique to blend in with legitimate services. To complete the installation, Hydrack needed to inject itself into the standard Windows service hosting process, svcos.exe. This process is responsible for running multiple Windows services, and it's normal to see several instances of svcos.exe running on any Windows system. By hiding inside svcos.exe, Hydrack became much harder to detect. Security tools looking for suspicious processes might overlook what appeared to be a legitimate Windows system component. The malware then performed an interesting trick to evade forensic analysis. It modified the file timestamps of the malicious DLL it had installed, changing the creation date, last modified date, and last access date to match those of a legitimate system DLL like user32.dll. Why does this matter? When forensic investigators respond to a security incident, they often look for recently created or modified files as indicators of malicious activity. By backdating its file timestamps, Hydrack made itself blend into the background noise of normal system files that had been present since Windows was installed. Once established, Hydrack connected to its command and control servers using a communication protocol designed to look like legitimate encrypted web traffic. The malware initiated what appeared to be SSL connections, the same type of encrypted traffic used for secure web browsing. To anyone monitoring network traffic, these connections would look normal unless they specifically decoded the traffic and analyzed its contents. The command and control infrastructure was distributed across multiple locations, with servers identified in Illinois, Texas, and Taiwan. This geographic distribution served multiple purposes. It provided redundancy in case one server was taken offline, it made attribution more difficult, and it reduced the chances that all the infrastructure would fall under the jurisdiction of a single law enforcement agency. The communication protocol Hydrack used was proprietary, custom-built for this operation. Security researchers who analyzed captured network traffic found that the malware used a specific sequence of bytes to establish its initial connection, what's sometimes called a magic number in protocol design. The server would respond with its own sequence, and then the malware would begin sending information about the infected system and receiving commands from the operators. What could the attackers do once they had Hydrack installed on a system? The malware's capabilities were extensive and revealed the objectives of the operation. Hydrack could enumerate running processes, allowing the attackers to see what software was running on the infected system. It could enumerate files and directories, letting the operators browse the contents of the hard drive remotely. It could upload files from the infected system to the command and control servers, the mechanism for stealing source code and sensitive documents. It could download and execute additional tools, allowing the attackers to extend their capabilities beyond what was built into the initial malware. Particularly sophisticated was Hydrack's ability to access and manipulate the Windows registry, the database that stores configuration settings for the operating system and installed applications. The malware could enumerate registry keys and values, revealing information about installed software, user accounts, security settings, and network configurations. It could create, modify, or delete registry entries, allowing the attackers to alter system settings, disable security software, or install additional backdoors. Hijack included functionality for process manipulation, the ability to start or terminate programs running on the infected system. This allowed the attackers to kill security software that might detect their presence or to launch tools they'd installed to expand their access. The malware could adjust token privileges, essentially granting itself elevated permissions to perform actions that would normally be restricted. One particularly revealing capability was Hijack's ability to clear Windows event logs. Event logs record system activities, security events, application errors, basically a journal of what's happening on a Windows computer. Security analysts investigating suspicious activity rely heavily on event logs to understand what happened and when. By clearing these logs, Hijack erased evidence of its activities, making forensic investigation much more difficult. The malware also included file system manipulation capabilities. It could delete files, useful for removing evidence or disrupting operations if the attackers chose to. It could modify file attributes, changing whether files were visible or hidden, read-only or writable. And critically, it could force the system to reboot or shut down, perhaps to complete installation of additional tools that required a restart or simply to cover its tracks. Buried in the malware's binary code were clues that would eventually help researchers understand its origins. When McAfee reverse-engineered Hijack, they discovered that some of the compiled code retained fragments of the source code's file paths. One sample included the path /Aurora_RC, which led McAfee researchers to name the Operation Aurora. This wasn't intentional on the part of the attackers. It was an artifact of how the malware was compiled, a small mistake that would give the operation its name and provide a tantalizing clue about how the attackers organized their work. Another fascinating technical detail emerged from analysis of the CRC checksumming algorithm Hijack used. CRC, or cyclic redundancy check, is a method for detecting errors in data transmission. The specific CRC implementation in Hijack was unusual. It used a 16-value lookup table instead of the standard 256-value table, an optimization designed to reduce memory usage. Security researcher Joe Stewart at Dell SecureWorks found only one public instance of source code that matched this implementation, and it was published in simplified Chinese as part of a paper on optimizing CRC algorithms for microcontrollers. The paper was available almost exclusively on Chinese websites. While not definitive proof of Chinese origin, it strongly suggested that the malware's author was comfortable reading technical documentation in simplified Chinese. Further analysis revealed that different variants of Hijack had compilation timestamps spread over several years. Some components appeared to have been created as early as 2006. This suggested that Operation Aurora wasn't a one-time effort, but rather the deployment of a toolkit that had been under development for years. The attackers had built a reusable platform for cyber-espionage, and Aurora was just one application of that platform. The malware's sophistication extended to how it concealed its activities. Hijack incorporated basic anti-forensic techniques designed to frustrate analysis. It encrypted some of its strings to prevent simple text searches from revealing its functionality. It used indirect function calls to make reverse engineering more time-consuming. It checked for signs that it was running in a virtual machine, a common technique security researchers use to safely analyze malware, and it could alter its behavior if it detected such an environment. One component of Hydrack that particularly worried security researchers was based on VNC, virtual network computing, an open-source remote desktop protocol. The attackers had incorporated VNC functionality into Hydrack, allowing them to watch the victim's screen in real time, see what applications they were using, what websites they were visiting, essentially looking over their shoulder as they worked. This capability turned the infected computer into a surveillance device. The attackers could watch as victims logged into sensitive systems, potentially capturing passwords and authentication credentials. They could see internal communications, proprietary documents, anything that appeared on the victim's screen. The technical analysis of Hydrack revealed attack tools built by professionals with significant expertise in Windows internals, malware development, network protocols, and operational security. This wasn't the work of amateur hackers or opportunistic cybercriminals. Every aspect of the malware's design showed signs of careful planning, extensive testing, and deliberate engineering choices made to maximize stealth, reliability, and functionality. Part 5. The Prize, Source Code, and Intellectual Property. To understand why Operation Aurora was so devastating, you need to understand what the attackers were actually after. They weren't looking for credit card numbers or social security data. They weren't deploying ransomware to extort money. They weren't trying to disrupt operations or destroy data. They were hunting for something far more valuable: source code. Source code is the human-readable form of computer software, the instructions written by programmers that get compiled into the executable programs we actually run. It's the recipe for the software, the blueprint that shows exactly how it works. For a technology company, source code represents the accumulation of years of development work, millions of dollars in investment, and countless hours of problem-solving by highly skilled engineers. It's not an exaggeration to call it the crown jewels. Think about what Google's source code represents. The search algorithm that made Google dominant, refined through years of improvement. The Gmail infrastructure that handles hundreds of millions of users' email. The Chrome browser codebase. The Android operating system. Each of these represents enormous intellectual property value. If a competitor had access to Google's source code, they could understand exactly how Google solved various technical problems. They could identify security vulnerabilities to exploit in future attacks. They could potentially even copy features or approaches to accelerate their own development. The same applied to the other companies targeted in Operation Aurora. Adobe's source code for products like Photoshop, Illustrator, and Acrobat Reader represented decades of image processing and document format expertise. Juniper Networks' source code for networking equipment contained proprietary protocols and security implementations. Symantec's security software source code would reveal exactly how their products detected and blocked threats. Defense contractors' source code might contain implementations of cryptographic algorithms, weapons system software, or classified communications protocols. But here's what made this source code theft particularly egregious. Many of these companies stored their source code in centralized software configuration management systems, and those systems were woefully insecure. Google used a product called Perforce to manage their source code repositories. Perforce was a popular choice among large corporations, used by hundreds of Fortune 1000 companies to version control and manage their intellectual property. It was industry standard, mature, and widely deployed. And according to the analysis that McAfee published after Operation Aurora, it was also riddled with security vulnerabilities. When McAfee examined Perforce's security model, they found a series of problems that would make any security professional wince. By default, Perforce allows any user to create an account without administrator approval. Just like that, anyone with network access to the Perforce server could create a user account and start browsing repositories. Authentication was weak, using unencrypted passwords transmitted over unencrypted connections. The entire system ran with administrative privileges, meaning any compromise of perforce gave the attacker system-level access to the server. Files were stored in plain text with no encryption. The list went on. In fairness to Perforce, they pointed out that their product had security features that could be enabled, and that the configuration McAfee analyzed was essentially the out-of-the-box evaluation setup with security turned off. But the fundamental problem remained. Many companies weren't properly securing their source code repositories. They'd invested heavily in perimeter security, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, antivirus software, all focused on keeping attackers out of the network. But once inside the network, access to critical intellectual property was often surprisingly easy. This reflected a broader problem in corporate security architecture that Operation Aurora exposed brutally. Most companies operated on what's called a castle and moat model. You build high walls around your network perimeter, you put guards at the gate, you dig a moat and fill it with alligators, metaphorically speaking. But once someone makes it past the perimeter, either because they found a weakness in your defenses or because they compromised a legitimate user's credentials, the inside of your network is relatively open. Systems trust each other because they're all inside the castle walls. The Aurora attackers exploited this model perfectly. They didn't need to break into Perforce directly. They compromised employee workstations that had legitimate access to Perforce. Those workstations had credentials stored, shortcuts to source code repositories, cached authentication tokens. Once the attackers controlled a developer's workstation, they could access source code just like the legitimate user would. They didn't need to exploit Perforce vulnerabilities directly because they already had legitimate access through compromised credentials. What did the attackers actually take? The full extent of the source code theft may never be publicly known. Companies are understandably reluctant to disclose exactly what intellectual property was compromised. Google acknowledged that source code had been accessed, but never specified which projects were affected. Adobe confirmed that source code for products including Acrobat Reader and Cold Fusion had been accessed. Other targeted companies even released vague statements or said nothing at all. But there are educated guesses based on what systems the attackers were observed targeting. At Google, there's evidence they accessed source code for Gmail, potentially giving them insight into how Google's email system worked and where its security weaknesses might be. They may have accessed search algorithm code, though Google never confirmed this. Given that Android development was ramping up significantly in late 2009, with the Nexus 1 set to launch in January 2010, Android source code repositories were likely among the targets. The value of this stolen source code extends far beyond simply copying features. When you have access to a competitor's source code, you gain deep insights into their technical decision-making. You can see which algorithms they chose and why. You can identify performance bottlenecks and understand how they solve particular problems. You can discover security vulnerabilities that might not be apparent from external analysis. You can understand their technology roadmap by seeing what features are being developed but not yet released. For a nation-state actor, particularly one interested in building domestic technology champions, this information is invaluable. China had made no secret of its desire to develop indigenous technology capabilities and reduce dependence on foreign technology companies. Having access to the source code of leading American tech companies would dramatically accelerate that goal. Chinese companies could see exactly how Google implemented search, how Adobe processed images, and how Symantec detected malware. They wouldn't need to spend years doing fundamental research because they could see the answers in the stolen code. There's also a military and intelligence angle to source code theft that goes beyond commercial competition. When you understand how software works at the source code level, you can find ways to attack it more effectively. If a foreign intelligence service has access to the source code for widely deployed software like Windows or Adobe Reader, They can search for vulnerabilities that the vendors don't know about. They can develop zero-day exploits that will work until the vendor discovers and patches the vulnerability. They can potentially insert backdoors into their own versions of the software that they distribute to surveillance targets. The source code theft component of Operation Aurora represented one of the largest intellectual property thefts in history, measured by the sheer value of what was taken. We're talking about software that represented billions of dollars in development investment, competitive advantages that companies had spent decades building. And it was all copied quietly, often without the victims knowing immediately that anything had been taken. Unlike physical theft, where you know something is missing, data theft can be invisible. The source code was still in Google's repositories, still in Adobe's systems. Everything looked normal. The only difference was that now someone else had a copy. This is one of the fundamental challenges of cybersecurity in the modern world. How do you protect information that can be copied without leaving any evidence? How do you detect when data has been exfiltrated if the original is still sitting exactly where it's supposed to be? Operation Aurora demonstrated that even sophisticated companies with significant security investments struggled to answer these questions. The intellectual property theft also raised uncomfortable questions about responsibility and liability. If a company's source code is stolen and that code contains security vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities are subsequently exploited by attackers to compromise end users, who is responsible? If Chinese companies use stolen American source code to build competing products, what recourse do the victims have? Can they sue in Chinese courts? Would the Chinese government cooperate with investigations? The answers to all these questions were essentially no, leaving the victim companies with little practical recourse beyond improving their security and hoping to catch the attackers next time. Part 6. Beyond Google, the full scope of Aurora. Google's public announcement about Operation Aurora in January 2010 captured headlines around the world, but Google was far from the only victim. The scope of the attack was staggering, encompassing at least 33 organizations across multiple sectors. Each victim had different assets that interested the attackers, but the common thread was intellectual property and strategic information that would benefit Chinese economic and security interests. Let's start with the other major technology companies. Adobe Systems, makers of Photoshop, Illustrator, and Acrobat Reader, confirmed they had been compromised. Adobe's software is ubiquitous. Hundreds of millions of people use Adobe Reader to view PDF documents. Creative professionals around the world rely on Photoshop and Illustrator. Access to Adobe's source code meant understanding exactly how these programs work, including any security vulnerabilities that might exist. PDF vulnerabilities in particular have been a persistent vector for malware delivery. If attackers understand how Adobe Reader processes PDF files, they can craft malicious documents that exploit parsing vulnerabilities. Yahoo, another internet giant, was on the target list. Yahoo in 2009 still controlled significant digital real estate. They owned Flickr, a massive photo-sharing platform. Yahoo Mail was still one of the most popular email services globally. Yahoo Finance was the go-to source for stock market information for millions of users. What were the attackers after at Yahoo? Email communications, potentially. User data that could be used to identify dissidents or activists. Technical intelligence about Yahoo's infrastructure and services. Juniper Networks, a major manufacturer of networking equipment used by internet service providers and large corporations worldwide, was compromised. This is particularly concerning because networking equipment is fundamental infrastructure. Routers and switches made by Juniper route enormous amounts of internet traffic. If the attackers gained access to Juniper's source code, they might be able to find vulnerabilities in deployed equipment that could be exploited for surveillance or disruption. Years later, in 2015, Juniper would announce the discovery of unauthorized code in their operating system that had been there since 2012, allowing sophisticated attackers to decrypt VPN traffic. Whether this was related to Aurora remains unclear, but it demonstrates the strategic value of compromising networking equipment manufacturers. Symantec, ironically a security company, was targeted. Symantec made Norton Antivirus, one of the most widely deployed consumer security products. They also sold enterprise security solutions used by corporations worldwide. The irony of a security company being compromised in a major cyber attack wasn't lost on observers. But more importantly, if attackers had access to Symantec's source code, they could understand exactly how Symantec's products detected threats. They could engineer their malware to evade detection by Symantec products specifically. This is a cat-and-mouse game that goes on constantly in the malware world, but having access to the actual source code of security software would be an enormous advantage. Rackspace, a major hosting provider, had customer accounts compromised. While Rackspace itself wasn't the target, the attackers used compromised Rackspace customer accounts to host their command and control infrastructure. This added layers of obfuscation to the attack. When investigators traced the command and control servers, they led to legitimate cloud hosting accounts, not obviously suspicious infrastructure. Rackspace customers whose accounts were compromised may have never known they were supporting a massive cyber-espionage operation. Northrop Grumman, a major defense contractor, was among the victims. Northrop Grumman builds military aircraft, including the B-2 stealth bomber. They develop radar systems, electronic warfare equipment, and other defense technologies. They work on classified programs for the Department of Defense and intelligence agencies. What intellectual property did the Aurora attackers access at Northrop Grumman? That information remains classified, but the implications are troubling. Defense contractor networks contain design specifications for weapons systems, technical data about military capabilities, information about ongoing defense programs. Dow Chemical, one of the world's largest chemical companies, was on the target list. This might seem odd at first. Why would cyber-espionage targeting technology companies also go after a chemical manufacturer? The answer lies in understanding industrial espionage from a state actor perspective. China has been accused repeatedly of economic espionage aimed at acquiring trade secrets and proprietary information that would benefit Chinese companies. Chemical manufacturing processes are complex and proprietary. Formulations for specialized chemicals, catalysts, polymers, these represent enormous research investment. If a Chinese chemical company could access Dow's proprietary processes, they could reproduce Dow's products without investing in the underlying research. Morgan Stanley, the financial services giant, was compromised. Investment banks deal in information, trading algorithms, market analysis, deal terms for mergers and acquisitions, client information, financial models. All of this is potentially valuable intelligence. For a state actor interested in understanding global financial flows, large investment banks are natural targets. There's also a counterintelligence angle. If you want to understand what Western investors think about your country's economy, accessing the internal documents of major financial institutions would provide tremendous insight. The list continued. Akamai Technologies, which provides content delivery network services that accelerate web traffic for major websites. Rackspace, the hosting provider. Additional defense contractors beyond Northrop Grumman. Security companies. Financial institutions. The common thread was that each victim possessed intellectual property, strategic information, or access that would benefit Chinese economic or security interests. What's particularly striking about this target list is its diversity. This wasn't a focused operation targeting one sector. The attackers were going after defense contractors and financial institutions, internet companies and chemical manufacturers, security firms, and hosting providers. This suggested a well-resourced operation with broad intelligence objectives. Different target categories required different areas of expertise to exploit effectively. You need to understand defense industry networks to compromise contractors. You need different skills to infiltrate chemical companies. The breadth of the Aurora campaign suggested either a large team with diverse capabilities or multiple related teams sharing infrastructure and tools. The geographic distribution of victims also told a story. While most were American companies, the target list included organizations in other countries as well. This suggested the attackers were following their intelligence objectives wherever they led, not limiting themselves to a single country. The global nature of modern technology companies meant that compromising a US-based company might also provide access to operations in Europe, Asia, or elsewhere. How were these diverse victims all compromised using similar techniques? The answer lies in the commonality of technology platforms. Most of these companies ran Microsoft Windows on employee workstations. Most used Internet Explorer as at least one of their standard web browsers. Most had employees who could be targeted with spear phishing. The specific details of the attacks varied by victim, but the overall approach was consistent. Identify targets, craft convincing spear phishing emails, exploit the Internet Explorer 0-day, install Hydrack, move laterally through the network, and extract valuable data. The coordination required to simultaneously compromise 33 different organizations is itself evidence of substantial resources and planning. Each target required reconnaissance, custom social engineering, monitoring of data exfiltration, and operational security to avoid detection. This wasn't one person with a laptop. This was a sustained operation involving multiple people, infrastructure, and management overhead. When news of Aurora became public, there was speculation that dozens more companies had been compromised but chose not to disclose it. Victim notification is always complicated in these situations. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies often ask compromised companies to keep quiet while investigations continue. Companies may choose not to disclose breaches if they're not legally required to do so, fearing reputational damage or lawsuits. The 33 confirmed victims may represent only the tip of the iceberg. The broader implication of Aurora's scope was that no one was safe. If Google with its enormous security resources could be compromised, if Symantec the security company could be breached, if defense contractors with classified networks could be infiltrated, then what chance would smaller organizations have? The attack demonstrated that determined state actors could penetrate even well-defended networks given enough time and resources. This realization sent shockwaves through corporate boardrooms. Chief information security officers found themselves explaining to CEOs and boards of directors how their companies might be vulnerable to similar attacks. Security budgets started increasing. Companies began taking the threat of state-sponsored cyber-espionage seriously in a way they hadn't before. Prior to Aurora, most corporate security focused on protecting against cybercriminals motivated by financial gain. Aurora demonstrated that there were adversaries with different motivations, longer time horizons, and greater resources. The diverse victim list also complicated attribution and response. With so many different organizations affected across multiple sectors, who should take the lead in investigating and responding? The FBI opened an investigation, but they were just one of many agencies involved. The Department of Homeland Security, the NSA, the Defense Department, all had interests in understanding Aurora and preventing similar attacks. Coordinating among all these agencies while also working with dozens of victim companies created enormous complexity. Part 7. The Human Rights Angle, Gmail, and Surveillance. While the source code theft grabbed headlines and worried technology executives, there was another dimension to Operation Aurora that elevated it from corporate espionage to something more sinister: the targeting of human rights activists. This aspect of the attack revealed motivations that went beyond economic advantage or military intelligence. The attackers were hunting for dissidents, trying to expose people whose communications might threaten the Chinese government's grip on power. The evidence for this came from multiple sources. Google reported that the attackers had specifically targeted Gmail accounts belonging to Chinese human rights activists. These weren't random account compromises. The attackers had a list. They knew whose communications they wanted to intercept, and they'd penetrated Google's network specifically to access those accounts. This represented a calculated effort to identify and surveil individuals whom the Chinese government considered threats. Who were these activists? Google never publicly identified specific victims, presumably to protect them from further targeting. But we can understand who they might be based on the political context of 2009. China was dealing with ongoing unrest in Tibet and Xinjiang. The government was intensely focused on controlling dissent following the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which had attracted international attention to human rights issues. Activists working on issues like Tibetan independence, Xinjiang separatism, Falun Gong, labor rights, or political reform were all potential surveillance targets. Gmail had become a critical communication tool for Chinese activists because it offered several advantages over domestic email services. It was encrypted in transit, making casual interception more difficult. It wasn't subject to the same level of censorship and surveillance that Chinese domestic email services faced. Google was an American company, not beholden to Chinese government pressure in the same way Chinese companies were. For activists communicating with international supporters, journalists, or other activists, Gmail represented relative security. But that security was compromised in Operation Aurora. The attackers gained access to account information, though Google maintained that they accessed only account metadata rather than the content of emails. What does that mean in practical terms? Metadata includes things like who sent emails to whom, when messages were sent, subject lines, IP addresses used to access accounts. Even without reading the actual content of emails, metadata can be incredibly revealing. It shows who is communicating with whom, social networks, patterns of communication. For an intelligence service trying to map dissident networks, metadata is enormously valuable. However, some reports suggested the intrusion went deeper than just metadata. There were indications that the attackers accessed a particular system within Google's infrastructure that was extremely sensitive. The mechanism Google had built to comply with U.S. law enforcement wiretap requests. This is where the story takes a particularly troubling turn. Under U.S. law, specifically the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, telecommunications and internet service providers must have the capability to allow law enforcement to conduct surveillance when authorized by a court. Google, as an email provider, was subject to these requirements. They had to build systems that would allow them to provide user data to law enforcement when presented with valid court orders. This made perfect sense for legitimate law enforcement purposes. If the FBI was investigating a terrorist and obtained a warrant to monitor that person's Gmail account, Google needed the technical capability to provide that access. But here's the problem with building backdoors. Even for legitimate purposes, they can be exploited by attackers who manage to gain access to them. The system Google built to comply with law enforcement requests was, by necessity, a centralized point of access to user communications. If an attacker could compromise that system, they could potentially access any Gmail account without needing to hack each individual account separately. They could essentially use Google's own surveillance infrastructure against Google's users. There's evidence suggesting this is exactly what happened in Operation Aurora. The attackers appeared to access the system Google used to flag accounts subject to wiretap orders. This would have given them a list of accounts that U.S. law enforcement was monitoring, which is itself enormously valuable counterintelligence information. But more importantly, it potentially gave them access to the mechanism for monitoring those accounts. Think about the implications. The Chinese government could identify which of their citizens U.S. intelligence or law enforcement was interested in. They could potentially see what information was being collected. They could monitor the same people the U.S. was monitoring, piggybacking on American surveillance infrastructure. And they could use this access to identify Chinese activists who might be communicating with U.S. government officials, journalists, or human rights organizations. This aspect of Aurora demonstrated a fundamental weakness in the lawful interception infrastructure that democracies build into their communication systems. The capability to conduct surveillance, even when built with appropriate legal safeguards and oversight, creates a centralized vulnerability. If that capability is compromised by a hostile actor, it becomes a tool for that actor's surveillance objectives. This is precisely what cryptographers and privacy advocates had been warning about for years, that building backdoors or surveillance capabilities into systems inherently made those systems less secure. Google's response to discovering this intrusion reflected the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just corporate espionage affecting Google's business interests. This was political surveillance that could literally put people's lives at risk. Dissidents in China face imprisonment, torture, forced disappearances. If the Chinese government identified activists through compromised Gmail accounts, those individuals could be arrested, their networks rolled up, their work dismantled. The human rights dimension also provided Google with moral clarity about what they needed to do. The company had been agonizing for years about the compromises required to operate in China, censoring search results, removing content at the government's request, essentially collaborating with authoritarianism in exchange for market access. Operation Aurora crystallized the consequences of those compromises. The same government demanding censorship was now actively hacking Google to surveil dissidents. The situation had become untenable. Beyond the specific Gmail accounts that were targeted, there was a broader implication about the security of communications for at-risk populations. Activists around the world rely on services provided by American tech companies partly because they trust that those companies aren't directly collaborating with authoritarian governments. But Aurora demonstrated that even when companies try to protect users, sufficiently sophisticated state actors can potentially compromise those protections. The security of dissident communications depends not just on encryption and corporate policies, but on the integrity of the entire system, from the operating systems people use to the networks their data traverses to the servers where their data is stored. The targeting of activists in Aurora wasn't an isolated incident. It fits into a broader pattern of Chinese government behavior toward dissent. The government had already demonstrated willingness to pressure companies like Yahoo to hand over user data that led to activists being imprisoned. They'd shown sophisticated capabilities in censoring and monitoring domestic internet communications. Aurora simply took this to the next level, actively penetrating foreign companies to access communications that the companies weren't willingly providing. For the broader human rights community, Aurora was a wake-up call about the risks of digital communications. Activists began re-evaluating their communication security, adopting stronger encryption, using more sophisticated operational security practices. Human rights organizations started providing better digital security training to activists in authoritarian countries. The assumption that services from American companies provided adequate protection evaporated. The Gmail surveillance component of Aurora also raised questions about what other governments might be doing similar things. If China had the capability and willingness to hack foreign email providers to monitor dissidents, were other authoritarian governments doing the same? Was Russia penetrating Gmail to monitor dissidents? Was Iran? Were democratic governments conducting similar operations against their own adversaries? The Snowden revelations a few years later would show that the NSA was indeed conducting massive surveillance operations, though through different means. Part 8. Discovery and Response: How They Caught Aurora. The story of how Operation Aurora was detected and analyzed is almost as fascinating as the attack itself. The discovery process involved a combination of technical monitoring, forensic investigation, and piecing together clues that eventually revealed the scope of what had happened. It's a case study in modern cybersecurity incident response, showing both the challenges of detecting sophisticated intrusions and the painstaking work required to understand them. The exact timeline of discovery varies slightly depending on which source you consult, but the general sequence of events is clear. Google's security team began noticing suspicious activity in mid-December 2009. The initial indicators were subtle: unusual network traffic patterns, login attempts from unexpected locations, small anomalies that might have been dismissed individually but which aggregated into a concerning pattern. What made detection difficult was that the Hydrak malware was designed specifically to blend in with normal network traffic. The SSL connections it established looked legitimate to standard monitoring tools. The malware used DNS requests that appeared normal. File transfers were throttled to avoid triggering alerts based on unusual data volumes. The attackers were patient, moving slowly through the network rather than racing to grab everything at once. They understood that speed increases the chances of detection, so they took their time. One of the key moments in the discovery process came when Google's security team identified compromised employee workstations. Once they'd isolated infected systems, they could analyze the malware, understand its capabilities, and begin tracing where it had spread. This is where the forensic investigation really began, examining disk images, analyzing memory dumps, reconstructing timelines of attacker activity. Google brought in outside expertise to help with the investigation. McAfee, one of the major antivirus and security companies, was brought in to analyze the malware samples and assist with the forensic investigation. This decision to involve external experts was important for several reasons. It provided additional technical capabilities beyond what Google's internal team had. It provided an independent verification of findings. And it meant that knowledge about the attack would be shared with the broader security community, helping other potential victims defend themselves. McAfee's analysis of Hydrak was thorough and revelatory. Their researchers reverse-engineered the malware, documenting its capabilities, command and control infrastructure, and technical characteristics. They identified the Internet Explorer zero-day vulnerability being exploited. They traced the command and control servers and began understanding the infrastructure supporting the attack. And importantly, they found that folder path string /Aurora_RC embedded in the malware binary, which led them to name the Operation Aurora. As Google investigated further, they made additional disturbing discoveries. The source code repositories had been accessed. Systems related to Gmail account monitoring had been compromised. The scope of the intrusion was far larger than initially suspected. The attackers had been inside the network for potentially weeks before detection, giving them ample time to explore, identify valuable targets, and exfiltrate data. Google also discovered something that would become important for attribution. The attack hadn't just targeted Google. As they shared information with law enforcement and other companies, a pattern emerged. Multiple organizations were reporting similar intrusions using the same techniques and infrastructure. Adobe confirmed they'd been compromised. Other companies started coming forward. The FBI began coordinating with multiple victim companies, trying to understand the full scope of the operation. The challenge of incident response in a situation like Aurora cannot be overstated. When you discover a sophisticated intrusion, you're faced with a series of difficult decisions. Do you immediately shut down systems to prevent further data loss, even though that might disrupt business operations? Or do you monitor the attackers to learn more about their objectives and methods, accepting that they might steal additional data while you watch? Do you go public immediately to warn other potential victims? Or do you keep quiet while law enforcement investigates? Google decided on a course of action that prioritized containment and then notification. They worked to remove the attackers from their network, patching systems, changing credentials, and improving monitoring. They notified law enforcement, providing information about the attack to help with the investigation. And critically, they made the decision to go public about the attack, which would lead to one of the most dramatic corporate announcements in tech history. But before we get to that announcement, it's worth understanding the technical work that went into understanding Aurora after its discovery. Security researchers at multiple organizations analyzed the malware samples, traced the infrastructure, and identified related attacks. This collaborative investigation process is common in the security community when major threats emerge. Companies that are normally competitors share information because sophisticated attacks threaten everyone. One fascinating aspect of the technical analysis was identifying connections between Aurora and other attack campaigns. Security researchers found similarities between hijack and malware used in other intrusions. The command and control infrastructure overlapped with infrastructure used for different attacks. Code reuse suggested that Aurora wasn't a one-off operation, but part of a broader campaign of cyber-espionage. This analysis led to the identification of what researchers called the Elderwood Group, a name given to the threat actor behind Aurora and related attacks. The Elderwood Group, as researchers reconstructed their activities, had been conducting operations for years. Aurora was one of their largest and most ambitious campaigns, but evidence suggested they'd been responsible for numerous other intrusions. The group showed a particular fondness for zero-day exploits, vulnerabilities in widely used software that the vendors didn't know about. Over the years, researchers would attribute exploits for vulnerabilities in Internet Explorer, Java, Adobe Flash, and other software to the Elderwood Group. Microsoft's role in the discovery and response to Aurora deserves special attention. When Google and others identified that the Internet Explorer zero-day was being used in the attacks, they immediately contacted Microsoft. This presented Microsoft with a difficult situation. They had an actively exploited vulnerability in one of their most widely deployed products. The vulnerability had been reported to them months earlier by a security researcher, but they hadn't yet released a patch, likely because they'd prioritized it for a future scheduled update rather than treating it as an emergency. Now, with evidence that the vulnerability was being used in a massive cyber-espionage campaign, Microsoft had to scramble to develop and test a patch. The normal patch development process takes time because changes to core software components like web browsers need to be thoroughly tested to ensure they don't break other functionality or create new problems. But the actively exploited nature of the vulnerability meant Microsoft couldn't wait for their next scheduled update cycle. While Microsoft worked on a patch, they released security advisories warning users about the vulnerability and suggesting workarounds. One recommendation was to disable certain ActiveX controls that the exploit relied on. Another was to consider using alternative browsers until a patch was available. This latter suggestion was remarkable because Microsoft was essentially telling people to stop using Internet Explorer, their own product, due to a security vulnerability. The patch, when it finally came, was released on January 21, 2010, as part of an out-of-band security update. Out-of-band means outside Microsoft's normal monthly patch cycle, reserved for vulnerabilities so serious they can't wait for the scheduled update. The fact that Microsoft deemed this necessary underscored the severity of the Aurora attacks. But here's the troubling part. The vulnerability had existed for years. The specific flaw that Aurora exploited had been present in Internet Explorer for multiple versions. Once Microsoft patched it, security researchers could reverse engineer the patch to understand what the vulnerability was. This raised an uncomfortable question. How long had the Elderwood Group known about and exploited this vulnerability? Were there attacks before Aurora using the same exploit that just weren't detected? How many other zero-day vulnerabilities did they have in their arsenal? The discovery and response process for Aurora demonstrated several important lessons about modern cybersecurity. First, detection of sophisticated intrusions is enormously difficult even for well-resourced organizations. Google had excellent security capabilities, and the attackers still managed to remain undetected for weeks. Second, response requires coordination among multiple organizations, including victim companies, security vendors, software manufacturers, and law enforcement. No single organization had all the information or capabilities needed to address Aurora comprehensively. Third, public disclosure plays an important role in community defense. By going public, Google warned other organizations and accelerated the defensive response across the industry. Part 9. Attribution: Tracking Aurora to China. One of the most sensitive and controversial aspects of Operation Aurora was attribution, the process of determining who was responsible for the attacks. In cyberspace, attribution is notoriously difficult. Attackers can route their traffic through multiple countries, use infrastructure located far from their actual location, and employ false flags designed to mislead investigators. But in the case of Aurora, multiple lines of evidence pointed consistently toward Chinese origin, and more specifically, toward Chinese government involvement. The technical evidence began with the malware itself. When researchers analyzed Hydrack, they found clues embedded in the code. Some of the compilation artifacts suggested Chinese language development environments. Comments and strings within the code, when they existed, were in Chinese. The CRC algorithm implementation matched source code published primarily on Chinese websites. These details weren't conclusive on their own, but they suggested the malware authors were comfortable working in Chinese language environments. The command and control infrastructure provided additional clues. While the servers used were distributed across multiple countries, including the United States and Taiwan, investigators traced the registration and payment information for these servers. The trail led back to China in many cases. The operational security around registering and operating this infrastructure showed patterns consistent with Chinese actors. The targeting of victims was itself evidence pointing toward Chinese state interests. The combination of companies targeted made sense from the perspective of Chinese economic and security objectives. Technology companies whose source code would benefit Chinese domestic champions. Defense contractors whose secrets would benefit the Chinese military. Financial institutions that could provide economic intelligence. And critically, the targeting of Chinese human rights activists showed objectives that aligned precisely with Chinese government priorities. Beyond the technical evidence, there were other indicators of state sponsorship. The sophistication and scale of Aurora suggested substantial resources. The attackers had access to zero-day exploits, operated a distributed command and control infrastructure, compromised more than 30 organizations simultaneously, and sustained operations over an extended period. This wasn't the work of individual hackers or even criminal groups. The operation showed signs of professional intelligence tradecraft. Beyond the technical evidence, there were other indicators of state sponsorship. The sophistication and scale of Aurora suggested substantial resources. The attackers had access to zero-day exploits, operated a distributed command and control infrastructure, compromised more than 30 organizations simultaneously, and sustained operations over an extended period. This wasn't the work of individual hackers or even criminal groups. The operation showed signs of professional intelligence tradecraft. Intelligence analysts from the U.S. government weighed in on attribution as well. While they were careful with public statements, senior officials indicated that the evidence pointed toward Chinese government involvement. The National Security Agency, which monitors foreign signals intelligence, would have had access to information beyond what private researchers could gather. Their assessment, while not publicly detailed, reportedly supported the conclusion that Aurora originated from China and likely involved government actors. The most explosive attribution claim came from the New York Times, which published a detailed investigation in February 2010. Based on interviews with sources involved in the investigation, the Times reported that the Aurora attacks had been traced to two specific institutions in China: Shanghai Jiaotong University and the Lanxiang Vocational School in Shandong Province. This was an extraordinarily specific attribution, going beyond Chinese hackers to identify actual physical locations. Shanghai Jiaotong University is one of China's most prestigious institutions, particularly for engineering and computer science. The university has close ties to the Chinese government and military. Research conducted there has both civilian and military applications. The computer science department was advanced enough to potentially house the technical expertise required for an operation like Aurora. However, university officials vehemently denied any involvement, suggesting that if computers at the university were involved, they might have been compromised themselves and used as intermediaries. The Lanxiang Vocational School was a more unusual suspect. It's a large technical school offering training in various skilled trades and technical fields. What made Lanxiang interesting from an intelligence perspective was its relationship with the Chinese military. The school had programs that trained People's Liberation Army personnel. It had contracts with military units. Some analysts speculated that Lanxiang might serve as a training ground or cover for military cyber operations, though this remains speculative. The Chinese government's response to these attribution claims was consistent and predictable: complete denial. Government spokespeople called the accusations groundless. They pointed out that China itself was a victim of cyber attacks, many originating from the United States. They suggested that evidence could be fabricated or that Chinese infrastructure might be used by attackers from other countries. They accused the United States of using cyber-espionage accusations as a pretext for protectionism and restricting Chinese companies' access to Western markets. These denials were expected, but they didn't address the weight of evidence that had accumulated. Attribution in cyberspace rarely reaches the level of absolute certainty, but the Aurora case came closer than most. Multiple independent sources of evidence, technical indicators, operational patterns, and intelligence assessments all pointed in the same direction. The probability that some other actor had gone to such lengths to frame China, using Chinese language tools, pursuing Chinese intelligence objectives, and operating from Chinese infrastructure, seemed vanishingly small. The Elderwood Group designation represented the security community's attempt to track the threat actor behind Aurora separately from broader questions of state attribution. By giving the group a name, researchers could track their evolution over time, identify new attacks using similar tools and techniques, and develop defenses. Over the years following Aurora, researchers would attribute numerous attacks to Elderwood, documenting their continued operations and evolving capabilities. One fascinating aspect of the Elderwood Group's operations was their apparent access to vulnerability information very early in its life cycle. They seemed to have exploits for zero-day vulnerabilities shortly after security researchers discovered them, sometimes even before the researchers had publicly disclosed the vulnerabilities. This raised uncomfortable questions about whether the group had compromised security researchers themselves, whether they had infiltrated the bug bounty programs that companies like Microsoft ran, or whether they had some other means of accessing vulnerability information. The attribution question extended beyond just identifying the attackers to understanding the command structure and objectives. Was Aurora an operation conducted directly by the Chinese government's intelligence services? Or was it outsourced to contractors with government connections? China's approach to cyber operations has historically involved a complex ecosystem of government agencies, military units, state-owned enterprises, and private contractors with varying degrees of official control. Operations might be directed by government intelligence officers, but executed by hackers with less formal military or intelligence connections. For the U.S. government, establishing attribution was important for determining how to respond. If this was a government-directed operation that might warrant a diplomatic response, public condemnation, or even retaliatory measures. If it was criminal activity that the Chinese government was simply failing to police, that would suggest different responses focused on law enforcement cooperation. The evidence strongly suggested government involvement, which shaped the U.S. response. Attribution also mattered for the victim companies. If you're Google and you've just suffered a massive breach that compromised source code and exposed your users to surveillance, understanding who did it and why affects your strategic response. A criminal adversary motivated by profit might be deterred by improved security. A nation-state adversary with strategic objectives won't be deterred the same way. You need different defensive strategies depending on who you're defending against. The public attribution of Aurora to China had significant diplomatic implications. It forced the issue of cyber-espionage onto the U.S.-China bilateral agenda in a way that had never happened before. Previous cyber incidents had been handled quietly through diplomatic channels. Aurora was different because Google went public, because the attacks were so widespread, and because the evidence of Chinese government involvement was strong enough that the U.S. government felt comfortable publicly supporting that conclusion, albeit cautiously. China's response evolved over time from outright denial to what might be characterized as deflection. Chinese officials and commentators began emphasizing that China itself suffered from cyber attacks, many originating from U.S. IP addresses. They pointed out that the United States had substantial cyber-espionage capabilities, as the Snowden revelations would later confirm definitively. They argued that the United States was hypocritical to condemn Chinese cyber operations while conducting its own. While this response didn't address the specific Aurora allegations, it sought to reframe the issue as one of general cyber conflict rather than Chinese wrongdoing. From a historical perspective, Operation Aurora represented one of the first major cyber operations publicly attributed to China where the evidence was comprehensive enough to make a convincing public case. Earlier incidents like the Titan rain intrusions in the mid-2000s had also been attributed to China, but with less public evidence and less dramatic victim disclosure. Aurora changed the calculation around attribution, demonstrating that sometimes the evidence is clear enough and the impact significant enough that staying silent isn't an option. The attribution question also highlighted a fundamental challenge in international relations in the cyber age. The traditional rules of espionage and international conflict were developed for a physical world. Intelligence services spy on each other. This is understood. But the scale and nature of cyber-espionage, the targeting of commercial companies rather than just governments, the theft of intellectual property for economic advantage rather than purely security intelligence, these aspects of Aurora and similar operations represented something that didn't fit neatly into existing frameworks. Part 10. Google's Ultimatum, the January 12th announcement. On January 12, 2010, Google dropped a bombshell that would reverberate through the technology industry, diplomatic circles, and the relationship between the internet and authoritarian governments worldwide. In a blog post titled "A New Approach to China," David Drummond, Google's senior vice president and chief legal officer, announced that Google had detected a highly sophisticated cyber attack originating from China, that the attack had targeted human rights activists, and that Google was reconsidering its entire approach to operating in China, including potentially shutting down Google.cn and withdrawing from the Chinese market entirely. The announcement was unprecedented in multiple ways. Major corporations simply didn't publicly call out nation-states for cyber-espionage. The normal approach was to handle breaches quietly, notify law enforcement, improve security, and move on. Companies worried about antagonizing governments, especially governments of major markets. They feared diplomatic complications, retaliatory measures, and loss of market access. Google was throwing that playbook out the window. The blog post itself was carefully worded but devastating in its implications. Drummond wrote that in mid-December, Google had detected what they later determined was a targeted attack on their corporate infrastructure originating from China. The attack, he noted, resulted in the theft of intellectual property from Google. But the most explosive part of the announcement came next. We have evidence to suggest that a primary goal of the attackers was accessing the Gmail accounts of Chinese human rights activists. This wasn't just corporate espionage. This was political surveillance aimed at dissidents. Google was effectively accusing the Chinese government, though without explicitly naming them, of conducting cyber operations to track and monitor human rights activists. The company noted that their investigation revealed that the activists' Gmail accounts had been routinely accessed by third parties, not just through the Aurora attack, but through phishing scams and malware on the activists' own computers. Google was pulling back the curtain on Chinese government surveillance operations. But Google went further. Drummond wrote that Google had discovered that this wasn't just about them. At least 20 other companies across multiple sectors had been similarly targeted. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a widespread campaign of cyber-espionage. And critically, Google stated that these attacks and the surveillance they revealed had led the company to conclude they could no longer continue censoring search results on Google.cn. This was the ultimatum. Google would negotiate with the Chinese government to operate an unfiltered search engine within China. If that proved impossible, Google was prepared to shut down Google.cn and potentially pull Google's offices out of China entirely. For a company that had agonized for years about the compromises required to operate in China, that had taken enormous criticism for those compromises, this represented a complete reversal of strategy. The announcement sent shockwaves through multiple domains simultaneously. In the technology industry, executives at other companies scrambled to understand what had happened and whether they'd been affected. The mention of 20 other targeted companies sent security teams into emergency investigation mode at organizations across Silicon Valley and beyond. Adobe would soon confirm they'd been breached. Other companies began quietly investigating whether they too had been Aurora victims. In diplomatic circles, Google's announcement created an uncomfortable situation. The US government now had a major American company publicly accusing China of cyber espionage and essentially declaring it would cease operations in China rather than continue under the existing terms. This wasn't a bilateral government dispute that could be managed through quiet diplomacy. This was a public confrontation that demanded public response. The State Department responded cautiously but supportively. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton issued a statement expressing concern about the cyber attacks and calling on China to conduct a thorough investigation. Clinton used Google's announcement as a springboard to discuss broader issues of internet freedom, giving a major speech on the topic later in January. The Obama administration walked a careful line, supporting Google's right to make business decisions while avoiding directly accusing the Chinese government of the attacks in official diplomatic communications. China's response was predictably defensive. Foreign Ministry spokespersons called Google's allegations groundless and accused the company of politicizing what should be commercial issues. They pointed out that all companies operating in China must abide by Chinese law, including censorship requirements. They suggested that Google was looking for an excuse to leave a market where they'd failed to dominate, that this was sour grapes dressed up as principle. Chinese state media went further in their attacks. Some commentary suggested Google was acting as a tool of the U.S. government, that the company was exaggerating security incidents to justify a politically motivated withdrawal from China. The nationalist rhetoric intensified, portraying Google's stance as Western arrogance and an attempt to impose American values on China. Within Google, the decision to make this announcement was not without internal debate. The company had significant operations in China. There were hundreds of Google employees in Chinese offices who might lose their jobs or face complications. There were concerns about retribution against Google employees or partners in China. The business case for staying in China remained substantial despite never achieving market dominance. But the human rights surveillance angle provided moral clarity. This wasn't just about business anymore. Real people's safety was at stake. The activists whose Gmail accounts had been targeted could face imprisonment or worse based on information the Chinese government might have obtained. For a company whose founders had emphasized "don't be evil" as a guiding principle, continuing to operate under these conditions became untenable. The announcement also reflected a calculation about reputation. Google had taken immense criticism for agreeing to censorship in China in the first place. That criticism had come from human rights organizations, from Congress, from privacy advocates, even from some Google employees who felt the company was betraying its principles. The compromise had always been uncomfortable. Aurora provided a catalyst to reverse course, and doing so publicly could help rehabilitate Google's reputation as a company that stood for internet freedom. The timing of the announcement, coming just weeks after the discovery of the breach, was also strategic. Going public quickly prevented the story from leaking in a less controlled way. It allowed Google to frame the narrative on their terms. It put pressure on the Chinese government to respond publicly rather than handling things quietly through diplomatic channels where China might face fewer consequences. One fascinating aspect of the announcement was what Google chose not to say publicly. The blog post mentioned intellectual property theft, but didn't specify what source code had been accessed. It mentioned at least 20 other targeted companies, but didn't name them. It suggested the attacks originated from China, but didn't explicitly accuse the Chinese government. These omissions were careful. Google provided enough information to convey the seriousness of the situation without revealing details that might compromise ongoing investigations or unnecessarily antagonize the Chinese government before negotiations about Google's future in China had even begun. The announcement fundamentally changed the conversation about tech companies operating in China. Before Aurora, the debate was about whether the benefits of providing limited internet access in China outweighed the costs of cooperating with censorship. After Google's announcement, the debate shifted to include the risks of state-sponsored cyber-espionage, surveillance of users, and theft of intellectual property. The calculus for whether to operate in China became more complex. Other technology companies watched Google's move with interest and concern. On one hand, Google was taking a principled stand that many admired. On the other hand, Google was also walking away from a huge potential market. Would other companies follow Google's lead? Would this become a watershed moment where Western tech companies collectively reconsidered their China strategies? Or would Google's exit simply create opportunities for competitors? In the immediate aftermath of the announcement, most companies chose to stay silent or issued bland statements expressing concern about cybersecurity while reaffirming their commitment to their Chinese operations. Microsoft, Yahoo, and others weren't ready to follow Google out of China. They had different risk calculations, different business models, different relationships with the Chinese government. Google's announcement also sparked broader discussion about the relationship between internet companies and governments, particularly authoritarian governments. What responsibilities do internet companies have to protect users from government surveillance? Under what circumstances is it acceptable to comply with censorship demands? When does market access become too costly in terms of values and user safety? These questions didn't have easy answers, but Aurora forced them into public discourse in a way that previous incidents hadn't. The January 12th announcement was just the opening salvo in what would become a months-long process of negotiation, posturing, and ultimately Google's exit from mainland China. But the announcement itself was the key moment, the point where a major American corporation decided that the combination of cyber-espionage, intellectual property theft, and human rights surveillance made continuing business operations in China untenable. It was a corporate decision that had geopolitical implications, a private company inserting itself into issues of internet governance and US-China relations in a way that was essentially unprecedented. Part 11. The immediate aftermath and Microsoft's scramble. The days and weeks following Google's January 12th announcement were chaotic across multiple fronts. While Google negotiated with the Chinese government about its future in China, the technology industry grappled with the security implications of Aurora, and Microsoft faced intense pressure to patch the Internet Explorer vulnerability that had made the attacks possible. Microsoft's position was particularly awkward. They'd known about the vulnerability since September 2009, when researcher Peter Vrugdenhill had reported it through Microsoft's Responsible Disclosure Program. Microsoft had assessed it and scheduled it for a future patch, likely in the normal February 2010 Patch Tuesday cycle. This was standard practice. Software companies receive vulnerability reports constantly and have to prioritize which ones require immediate action versus which can wait for scheduled updates. But Aurora changed the calculus. Now there was an actively exploited zero-day vulnerability in Internet Explorer being used in a massive cyber-espionage campaign that had compromised dozens of major companies. The vulnerability was public knowledge. Security researchers were analyzing it. Attackers beyond the original Aurora group might weaponize it. Microsoft couldn't wait for a scheduled patch release. On January 14th, just 2 days after Google's announcement, Microsoft issued Security Advisory 979352, acknowledging the vulnerability and providing workarounds while a patch was being developed. The advisory was remarkably specific, detailing the exact vulnerability, explaining how the exploit worked, and providing technical mitigation steps that system administrators could implement immediately. The recommended workarounds revealed the severity of the situation. Microsoft suggested disabling certain ActiveX controls that the exploit relied on. They recommended setting Internet Explorer's security zone to high to block ActiveX controls and active scripting. For corporate environments, they suggested using Microsoft's data execution prevention feature. And notably, they suggested considering alternative web browsers until a patch was available. That last recommendation was extraordinary. Microsoft was essentially telling people to stop using Internet Explorer. For a company whose browser had dominated the market for years, whose entire web strategy was built around Internet Explorer, this was an admission of serious vulnerability. The German government went even further, issuing an official warning to German citizens to stop using Internet Explorer entirely until the vulnerability was patched. France's Computer Emergency Response Team issued similar warnings. The browser market dynamics of 2010 made these recommendations practically feasible in a way that might not have been true earlier. Mozilla Firefox had gained significant market share. Google Chrome, launched in 2008, was growing rapidly. Apple's Safari had a dedicated following. Users and organizations had alternatives if they chose to abandon Internet Explorer temporarily or permanently. While Microsoft worked on a patch, security researchers analyzed the vulnerability in detail. The flaw existed in how Internet Explorer handled certain operations involving the document object model, specifically around object deletion and memory management. The exploit triggered a use after free condition, where Internet Explorer would attempt to use memory that had already been freed, allowing attackers to hijack execution flow and run arbitrary code. In security researcher terminology, this was categorized as CV 2010-0249. The patch development process was complicated by the need for thorough testing. Internet Explorer was deeply integrated into Windows in ways that made changes potentially risky. The browser's rendering engine was used by other applications. Changes to core functionality could break compatibility with legitimate websites and applications. Microsoft had to balance the urgency of patching an actively exploited vulnerability against the risk of releasing an inadequate or problematic patch. On January 21, 2010, Microsoft released MS-10-002, an out-of-band security update that patched the Internet Explorer vulnerability. Out-of-band meant it was being released outside Microsoft's normal monthly update cycle, reserved for critical vulnerabilities that couldn't wait. The patch was marked as critical, Microsoft's highest severity rating, for all supported versions of Internet Explorer across all supported versions of Windows. The patch addressed the memory management issue that the exploit relied on, preventing the use after free condition. Microsoft's security bulletin credited Peter Vrugdenhill, the original reporter of the vulnerability, and noted that the vulnerability had been publicly disclosed. What the bulletin didn't emphasize was that Microsoft had known about it for months before Aurora forced their hand. The incident raised uncomfortable questions about Microsoft's vulnerability disclosure and patching processes. Security researchers and critics pointed out that if Microsoft had prioritized this vulnerability when it was originally reported in September, Aurora might have been prevented or at least significantly hampered. Microsoft maintained that they couldn't patch every reported vulnerability immediately, that prioritization was necessary given the volume of security issues, and that there was no indication in September that the vulnerability was being actively exploited. This debate touched on broader issues in software security. Should vendors always treat zero-day vulnerabilities as critical and rush to patch them, even without evidence of active exploitation? Or is it reasonable to prioritize based on exploitation likelihood and other factors, accepting that some vulnerabilities will be exploited before patches are released? There's no easy answer, and Microsoft's handling of CV 2010-0249 became a case study in these dilemmas. Meanwhile, other companies targeted in Aurora were conducting their own investigations and response efforts. Adobe confirmed on January 12, the same day as Google's announcement, that they too had been attacked. Their statement was more restrained than Google's, acknowledging the breach but not providing extensive details about what had been compromised or making dramatic ultimatums about their operations. Adobe's investigation revealed that source code for Adobe Reader and Cold Fusion had been accessed by the attackers. This was serious for multiple reasons. Adobe Reader was installed on hundreds of millions of computers worldwide as the standard PDF viewing application. If attackers had access to the source code, they could search for security vulnerabilities to exploit in future attacks. Cold Fusion, while less ubiquitous, was widely used for web applications and vulnerabilities that could affect numerous websites. Other targeted companies faced difficult decisions about disclosure. Some confirmed publicly that they'd been affected, though usually without providing details. Rackspace acknowledged that customer accounts had been compromised and used as part of the attack infrastructure. Northrop Grumman and other defense contractors were in a particularly sensitive position, potentially dealing with classified information compromises that couldn't be disclosed publicly. Many companies chose to remain silent. There was no legal requirement for most of them to disclose the breaches. Data breach notification laws that existed in 2010 primarily applied to situations where customer data, like credit card numbers or social security numbers, had been compromised. Source code theft or intellectual property loss didn't trigger the same notification requirements. Companies that disclosed did so voluntarily, either because they felt it was the right thing to do or because they calculated that silence would be worse if the breach leaked anyway. The security industry response to Aurora was intense and multifaceted. Antivirus companies updated their products to detect Hydrack and its variants. Intrusion detection systems added signatures for Aurora-related traffic. Security consultants began offering Aurora response services, helping companies determine if they've been compromised and improve their defenses. Conferences and webinars about Aurora proliferated, with security professionals trying to learn from the incident and understand the implications for their own organizations. One significant outcome was increased attention to the insider threat and the limitations of perimeter security. Aurora had demonstrated that even sophisticated perimeter defenses could be bypassed through social engineering and zero-day exploits. Once attackers had compromised employee workstations inside the network perimeter, they could move laterally and access sensitive resources. This realization would eventually drive significant changes in security architecture, though those changes would take years to fully materialize. The incident also sparked discussion about software supply chain security. The fact that attackers had accessed source code repositories raised concerns about whether they might have injected malicious code into software that would then be distributed to millions of users. While there was no evidence that this happened in Aurora, it demonstrated the risk. Software companies began reviewing their development and release processes, looking for ways to ensure code integrity and prevent malicious insertions. In the weeks following Aurora, government agencies became more involved in both investigation and policy response. The FBI was investigating the criminal aspects of the intrusions. The NSA was analyzing the techniques and tools used to understand the threat actors' capabilities. The Department of Homeland Security was working with victim companies to improve critical infrastructure security. This multi-agency response reflected the complexity of Aurora, which touched on criminal law enforcement, national security, economic security, and critical infrastructure protection. Part 12. Google's exit from China. The period between Google's January 12th announcement and their ultimate exit from mainland China was marked by tense negotiations, public posturing, and growing inevitability that the relationship couldn't continue. Google had drawn a line in the sand. They wanted to operate an unfiltered search engine in China, or they would leave. The Chinese government had its own red line. Any company operating within Chinese borders must comply with Chinese law, including content censorship. These positions were irreconcilable. Throughout January and February 2010, Google representatives met with Chinese government officials to explore possible solutions. Could Google perhaps relocate its servers outside China and serve Chinese users from abroad, bypassing censorship requirements? Could there be some middle ground on what content was censored? Could Google operate under a special arrangement given its global importance? The answer, it became clear, was no on all counts. The Chinese government's position was that internet sovereignty was non-negotiable. China had every right to determine what content was permissible within its borders, just as other countries had broadcast standards or content regulations. Foreign companies were welcome to operate in China, but they had to play by Chinese rules. Google's suggestion that it deserved special treatment was dismissed as arrogance. Behind the scenes, the situation was complicated by the fact that Google didn't just operate a search engine in China. They had engineering offices in China where Chinese employees worked on products for global markets. They had sales teams supporting advertisers. They had partnerships with Chinese companies. A complete withdrawal wasn't as simple as shutting down a website. It involved real people's jobs and livelihoods, contractual obligations, and complex business relationships. Throughout this period, Google.cn remained operational, but the situation was clearly unsustainable. Chinese government officials made pointed comments about Google needing to respect Chinese law if it wanted to continue operations. Chinese media portrayed Google as trying to pressure the Chinese government through threat of withdrawal, suggesting this was a negotiating tactic rather than a principled stand. Some Chinese netizens actually supported Google's position, viewing it as standing up for internet freedom, though such sentiment was carefully censored online within China. On March 22, 2010, Google made its final move. Rather than shutting down Google.cn entirely, which would have left Chinese users with no access to Google services, the company redirected mainland China users to google.com.hk, the Hong Kong version of Google's search engine. Hong Kong, as a special administrative region of China, operates under a one country, two systems framework that provides for different laws, including fewer restrictions on speech and internet content. This was a clever technical solution that allowed Google to claim they were no longer censoring search results for Chinese users while technically complying with their commitment to not completely abandon those users. Users in mainland China could access Google's Hong Kong site and receive uncensored search results, though the Great Firewall could still block specific results or intermittently disrupt access to the Hong Kong site entirely. The Chinese government was not amused by this workaround. They viewed it as Google trying to circumvent Chinese law. Over the following weeks and months, access to Google services from mainland China became increasingly unreliable. The Great Firewall would intermittently block Google searches or slow them to unusable speeds. Gmail access became problematic. YouTube, which Google owned, was already blocked and remained so. China was making it clear that while they wouldn't officially kick Google out, they could make operating conditions untenable. Google maintained some presence in China even after the redirect. The offices remained open for a time, though with reduced staffing. Google continued to sell advertising to Chinese companies wanting to reach users outside China. Some services like Google Translate remained accessible. But the golden age of Google in China is over. The company would never again have the market presence it had hoped for when it first entered China in 2006. The impact on Google's business was significant but not catastrophic. China was a meaningful market, but Google had never achieved dominance there. Baidu remained the leading search engine, and Google's market share in China was respectable but not dominant. More concerning was the precedent. If Google couldn't make China work, and if US-China technology relations continued to deteriorate, what did that mean for the future of global technology companies? For Baidu and other Chinese tech companies, Google's exit was an enormous opportunity. Baidu's market share increased as Google's presence diminished. Chinese companies could now compete without worrying about the global leader in search. The exit also fed into a broader narrative within China about developing domestic technology champions rather than relying on foreign companies. If Google wouldn't play by Chinese rules, fine, China would build its own Google. The exit also had implications for Google employees in China. Many chose to leave the company rather than relocate. Some joined Chinese tech companies, bringing with them knowledge and experience from Google. In a way, Google's exit resulted in a transfer of talent and know-how to the Chinese tech industry, though not in the direct way that source code theft would have accomplished. Google's experience became a cautionary tale for other Western tech companies considering how to approach the Chinese market. The episode demonstrated that principled stands could be expensive, that authoritarian governments wouldn't necessarily bend to pressure from even major corporations, and that the costs of operating in restricted markets might exceed the benefits. Yet most other major tech companies chose to continue trying to make China work, calculating differently than Google had about acceptable compromises. The Chinese government's handling of the situation also sent signals to other companies. They'd shown that no company, not even Google, was indispensable. If a major American tech company wanted to take a public stand against Chinese policies and use market withdrawal as leverage, the Chinese government would call that bluff. This arguably strengthened China's negotiating position with other foreign companies, who saw that threats to withdraw wouldn't necessarily produce concessions. Years later, the wisdom of Google's decision remains debated. Did they do the right thing by prioritizing principle over profit? Or did they squander an opportunity to shape the Chinese internet from within? From a human rights perspective, Google's stand was admirable. They'd refused to continue cooperating with surveillance of activists. They'd rejected censorship. They'd been willing to sacrifice market access for values. From a business perspective, the calculation was murkier. Google missed out on years of growth in the world's largest internet market. Whether the reputational benefits and moral high ground compensated for lost revenue is a question without a clear answer. What is clear is that Operation Aurora was the catalyst for this entire chain of events. Without the attacks, Google might have continued its uncomfortable accommodation with Chinese censorship indefinitely. The cyber attacks, and particularly the targeting of human rights activists, provided both the trigger and the justification for a strategic reversal that Google's leadership had perhaps been looking for. Part 13. The birth of modern enterprise security. Operation Aurora's impact extended far beyond the immediate victims and the diplomatic fallout between the United States and China. The incident fundamentally reshaped how enterprises thought about cybersecurity, triggering a wave of innovation and architectural rethinking that continues to influence security strategies today. Aurora revealed that the traditional approach to defending corporate networks was fundamentally inadequate against determined, sophisticated adversaries. The traditional security model that Aurora exposed as insufficient was built on what security professionals call the castle and moat, or perimeter defense strategy. The basic idea was straightforward: build strong defenses at the network boundary. Deploy firewalls to control what traffic can enter or leave the network. Use intrusion detection systems to watch for suspicious activity at the perimeter. Filter email for malware. Block access to malicious websites. The assumption was that if you kept attackers outside your network perimeter, the internal network could be relatively trusted. Aurora demonstrated definitively that this model was broken. The attackers bypassed the perimeter not by breaking through it directly, but by tricking legitimate users into letting them in. The spear phishing emails and the Internet Explorer exploit effectively gave attackers credentials and access that looked legitimate from the network's perspective. Once inside the perimeter, the attackers found that internal networks were relatively flat, with insufficient segmentation and access controls. Systems trusted each other by default because they were all inside the network. Google's response to Aurora included a fundamental rethink of their security architecture that would eventually be published as a model called Beyond Corp. The core insight was to eliminate the concept of a trusted internal network entirely. Instead of assuming that being inside the corporate network meant you were trusted, every access request should be authenticated and authorized based on what we know about the user and device, regardless of where they're connecting from. An employee sitting in a Google office should have to prove their identity and authorization just as rigorously as someone connecting remotely. This approach, which came to be called Zero Trust Security, represented a fundamental shift in philosophy. In a zero-trust model, you don't trust anyone by default, including employees, including devices inside your network perimeter, including applications running on corporate systems. Every access request is verified. Every transaction is encrypted. Every action is logged and monitored. Trust is never assumed. It's always verified. Implementing zero trust requires several key components. Strong identity verification is essential, often using multi-factor authentication that combines something you know, password, with something you have, phone or security key, and potentially something you are, biometric. Device posture assessment checks that the device requesting access is properly configured, up to date, and not showing signs of compromise. Microsegmentation divides the network into small zones where traffic between zones is strictly controlled. Continuous monitoring watches for anomalous behavior even from authenticated users. Least privilege access ensures users and applications only have the minimum access needed to perform their functions. Google wasn't alone in rethinking security architecture after Aurora. Across the industry, security teams recognized that detecting sophisticated intrusions required better visibility into what was happening inside their networks. This drove adoption of more comprehensive logging and security information and event management systems. If attackers were going to be inside your network, potentially for weeks before detection, you needed the ability to forensically reconstruct what they'd done, what data they'd accessed, what systems they'd compromised. The concept of assume breach became more prominent. Instead of focusing exclusively on keeping attackers out, security programs began emphasizing resilience and response. How quickly can we detect an intrusion after it occurs? How effectively can we contain an incident once detected? How rapidly can we recover from a compromise? These questions became as important as prevention. Aurora also accelerated the adoption of threat intelligence sharing. The security community recognized that sophisticated adversaries were targeting multiple organizations with similar techniques. If Company A was attacked today, Company B might be attacked tomorrow using similar methods. Sharing information about threats, attack patterns, and indicators of compromise could help the entire community defend more effectively. This led to both formal information sharing programs and informal peer networks where security professionals compared notes. The attackers' use of zero-day exploits in Aurora highlighted the limitations of signature-based detection. Traditional antivirus software works by recognizing known malware signatures. If the malware is new and hasn't been seen before, signature-based detection fails. This drove interest in behavior-based detection that looks for suspicious activity patterns rather than known malware signatures. Technologies like sandboxing, where suspicious files are executed in isolated environments to observe their behavior, became more sophisticated and widely deployed. The compromise of source code repositories in Aurora triggered security improvements in how companies manage their intellectual property. Perforce and other source code management systems improved their security features. Companies implemented stronger access controls on their repositories, requiring multi-factor authentication, logging all access, and monitoring for unusual patterns. Some organizations implemented data loss prevention systems to watch for large downloads or unusual data movements that might indicate intellectual property theft. Aurora also influenced how companies thought about third-party risk. The attackers had used compromised infrastructure from legitimate hosting providers like Rackspace. They'd exploited trust relationships between organizations. This raised awareness that an organization's security is only as strong as its weakest partner or vendor. Security due diligence for third-party vendors became more rigorous, with companies requiring audits, security certifications, and contractual commitments around cybersecurity. Employee training and awareness programs evolved in response to Aurora's sophisticated spear phishing component. Generic, don't click on suspicious links, training was clearly insufficient when the attacks were so well crafted. Organizations began implementing more sophisticated training, including simulated phishing campaigns where employees would receive fake but realistic phishing emails, with those who clicked receiving additional education. The goal was to create a security-aware culture where employees were vigilant and reported suspicious activity. The role of chief information security officers changed after Aurora. Prior to major incidents like Aurora, cybersecurity was often viewed as an IT function handled by technical staff without significant executive attention. Aurora demonstrated that cyber threats were business risks that required board-level attention and CEO involvement. CISOs gained more influence, larger budgets, and direct reporting lines to senior leadership. Cybersecurity became a regular topic in boardrooms, not just IT departments. Incident response capabilities matured significantly. Companies realized they needed formal incident response plans, trained teams, and relationships with external forensics experts before incidents occurred, not during them. Regular tabletop exercises where teams simulated responding to various attack scenarios became standard practice. The goal was to reduce response time and improve effectiveness when real incidents occurred. The legal and regulatory environment began changing in response to Aurora and similar incidents. While Aurora itself primarily involved intellectual property theft that wasn't covered by existing data breach notification laws, the incident contributed to momentum for broader cybersecurity regulations. Industries began facing requirements for specific security controls, incident reporting, and third-party risk management. This regulatory pressure reinforced the business case for security investments. Aurora also influenced how security tools were architected and deployed. The attackers' use of SSL encryption to hide their command and control traffic highlighted the challenges of inspecting encrypted traffic. This drove adoption of SSL inspection capabilities, though balanced against privacy concerns about decrypting traffic. The need to detect subtle indicators of compromise led to investments in machine learning and artificial intelligence for security analytics, using algorithms to identify anomalous patterns that human analysts might miss. The concept of security operations centers, or SOCs, evolved to operate on a 24/7 basis with sophisticated monitoring capabilities. Instead of security being something checked periodically, it became continuous monitoring and analysis. Teams of security analysts would watch for indicators of compromise, investigate alerts, and coordinate responses. The most mature organizations implemented what's called threat hunting, where security teams proactively search their networks for signs of compromise rather than waiting for alerts. One particularly important outcome was the development of frameworks for understanding and defending against advanced persistent threats, or APTs. Aurora was one of the first widely publicized APT incidents. The security community needed ways to characterize these sophisticated, persistent, targeted attacks that were different from opportunistic cybercrime. Frameworks like the MITRE ATT and CK Matrix documented the tactics, techniques, and procedures that APT groups used, giving defenders a common language and reference for understanding threats. Google's own security evolution after Aurora was particularly notable. The company invested heavily in security engineering, developing custom security tools and infrastructure. They built systems to automatically analyze code for vulnerabilities. They created security keys for strong authentication. They developed advanced threat detection capabilities. Many of these innovations would eventually be shared with the broader community or commercialized as products, spreading Google's security lessons to other organizations. The cloud computing model gained security advantages in the post-Aurora world. Cloud providers could invest in security at a scale that individual companies couldn't match. They could hire teams of security experts, deploy sophisticated monitoring tools, and respond to threats with resources that few organizations could afford independently. While cloud computing brought its own security challenges, the shared responsibility model where cloud providers secured the infrastructure allowed companies to focus on securing their applications and data. Network segmentation became more sophisticated after Aurora. Instead of relatively flat internal networks, organizations implemented microsegmentation, dividing their networks into many small zones with strict controls on traffic between zones. This limited lateral movement, making it harder for attackers who compromised one system to access others. Software-defined networking made this kind of granular segmentation more practical and manageable. The concept of privileged access management gained prominence. Aurora had demonstrated how attackers could abuse credentials and privileges to access sensitive systems. Organizations implemented stricter controls on administrative access, requiring justification, approval, and monitoring for elevated privileges. Just-in-time access, where privileges are granted temporarily as needed rather than permanently, became more common. Password vaulting secured and rotated privileged credentials. Endpoint detection and response, or EDR, emerged as a critical security control. Traditional antivirus detected known malware, but missed sophisticated threats like hijack. EDR provided continuous monitoring of endpoint devices, recording process execution, file operations, network connections, and registry changes. This data enabled both detection of suspicious activity and forensic reconstruction after incidents. When an endpoint showed signs of compromise, EDR could isolate it from the network, contain the threat, and preserve evidence. The security industry itself grew substantially in the decade following Aurora. Venture capital flowed into security startups. New categories of security products emerged. The market for security services expanded. Cybersecurity became recognized as a critical business function rather than just a cost center. This growth created opportunities but also challenges, as organizations struggled to integrate numerous security tools and make sense of the avalanche of security data they generated. Aurora's lessons extended to how organizations thought about resilience and recovery. Since perfect prevention was impossible against determined adversaries, organizations needed to be able to recover quickly from compromises. This meant having good backups, tested recovery procedures, redundant systems, and plans for continuing operations during incidents. Security and business continuity became more closely integrated. The incident also highlighted the importance of threat modeling, the practice of systematically identifying potential threats, assessing their likelihood and impact, and prioritizing defensive measures. Rather than trying to defend against everything equally, organizations needed to understand their crown jewels, who might want to steal them, and how attackers might try. This risk-based approach to security allowed more efficient allocation of limited security resources. Years after Aurora, its influence remained visible in how enterprises approached cybersecurity. The shift towards zero-trust architecture continued to accelerate. The concept of assumed breach became fundamental to security thinking. The recognition that determined, sophisticated adversaries could penetrate traditional defenses drove continuous evolution of security practices. Aurora didn't solve cybersecurity challenges, but it catalyzed significant progress in how organizations defended themselves. Part 14. The Elderwood Group's Evolution and Legacy. The threat actor behind Operation Aurora didn't disappear after January 2010. The Elderwood Group, as security researchers designated them, continued operations for years afterward, evolving their techniques and targeting new victims. Tracking their activities over time revealed patterns about how sophisticated cyber-espionage groups operate, adapt, and persist. In the months and years following Aurora, security researchers identified numerous attacks that showed technical and operational similarities to Aurora. The same command and control infrastructure would reappear. Similar malware variants would be discovered. The targeting patterns suggested the same intelligence priorities. While definitively attributing these attacks to the exact same individuals behind Aurora was impossible, the circumstantial evidence suggested continuity of operations by the same organization or closely related groups. One of Elderwood's most notable characteristics was their appetite for zero-day exploits. After the Internet Explorer vulnerability used in Aurora was patched, the group didn't simply give up. They moved to new zero-day exploits in different software. Security researchers documented Elderwood exploiting vulnerabilities in Adobe Flash Player, Java, Microsoft Office, and other widely deployed software. Each time a vulnerability was discovered and patched, the group would acquire or discover new ones. This pattern revealed something important about Elderwood's resources and priorities. Zero-day exploits are expensive and difficult to obtain. You either need sophisticated vulnerability research capabilities to discover them yourself, or you need to acquire them from the gray market where researchers and exploit developers sell vulnerability information. The fact that Elderwood consistently had access to 0 days suggested substantial resources, possibly indicating continued state sponsorship. The targets of Elderwood attacks after Aurora showed some evolution, but maintained consistent themes. Defense contractors remained priority targets. Technology companies, particularly those with valuable intellectual property, continued to be compromised. Human rights organizations and Tibetan activist groups faced persistent targeting. There was also increased focus on think tanks, policy organizations, and groups involved in China-related issues. This targeting pattern aligned with Chinese intelligence interests. One particularly notable campaign attributed to Elderwood was dubbed Operation Shady Rat by McAfee researchers who documented it in 2011. This operation, which had been ongoing since at least 2006 and possibly earlier, affected more than 70 organizations worldwide. The victims included governments, defense contractors, technology companies, and even sports organizations. The breadth was staggering, suggesting a well-resourced adversary pursuing multiple intelligence objectives simultaneously. The malware used by Elderwood evolved over time. While Hydrack had been sophisticated, subsequent malware variants showed continued development. They incorporated new evasion techniques to avoid detection by security software. They used more sophisticated encryption for command and control communications. They implemented modular architectures that allowed attackers to load additional capabilities as needed rather than including everything in the initial malware payload. This evolution suggested professional development, teams continuously improving their tools. Elderwood's operational security also improved after Aurora's public exposure. The group became more careful about leaving clues that could be used for attribution. The command and control infrastructure became more complex, using multiple layers of proxies and compromised systems to obscure the ultimate destination of stolen data. The malware was compiled more carefully to avoid including identifying strings or debugging information. The group learned from Aurora's exposure and adapted their tradecraft accordingly. However, some patterns remained consistent enough to allow tracking. The targeting profile remained similar enough that researchers could identify likely Elderwood operations based on who was being attacked and what was being stolen. Certain technical signatures in the malware, while evolving, retained enough commonality to suggest the same developers or at least access to the same codebase. The infrastructure, while more obscured, sometimes showed links to previously identified Elderwood operations. The relationship between Elderwood and other Chinese APT groups observed by security researchers remains unclear. The U.S. intelligence community and private sector researchers have tracked numerous Chinese threat actors, often designated with numbers like APT-1, APT-3, APT-10, etc. Whether Elderwood was one of these groups, a component of one of them, or a separate entity is debated. The lack of transparency from the Chinese government about its cyber operations makes definitive organizational mapping impossible. What is clear is that Elderwood represented one point in a broader ecosystem of Chinese cyber-espionage capabilities. China has developed a sophisticated cyber warfare and intelligence capability involving multiple military units, civilian intelligence agencies, state-owned enterprises, and contractors. Different groups have different focuses, different technical capabilities, and different intelligence requirements. Elderwood appeared to focus on high-value targets where intelligence collection required sophisticated technical capabilities to overcome strong defenses. The evolution of Elderwood's operations reflected broader trends in state-sponsored cyber operations. As defenses improved, attackers adapted. The cat-and-mouse game between attackers and defenders accelerated. Techniques that worked in 2009 became less effective as awareness spread and defenses improved, pushing attackers to develop new approaches. This dynamic continues today, with both sides constantly evolving. One lasting impact of Elderwood's operations, including Aurora, was the erosion of trust in widely used software platforms. The repeated exploitation of vulnerabilities in Internet Explorer, Java, Flash Player, and other common software highlighted the security challenges of the modern computing ecosystem. Users and organizations became more cautious about plugins and browser extensions. Software vendors faced pressure to improve their security development practices and respond more quickly to vulnerability reports. The entire software industry was pushed toward more secure defaults and faster patching. Elderwood's persistence also demonstrated a reality about modern cyber threats. Sophisticated adversaries don't just attack once and disappear. They are persistent, patient, and well-resourced. They can afford to fail repeatedly and try new approaches. They can wait months or years for the right opportunity. This persistence requirement drives the need for security programs that are equally persistent, continuously monitoring, continuously improving, never assuming that yesterday's defenses are sufficient for tomorrow's threats. The intelligence value that China presumably obtained from Elderwood's operations over the years is difficult to quantify, but likely substantial. Access to defense contractor networks providing information about military capabilities and programs. Technology company source code enables Chinese firms to compete more effectively. Communications of activists allowing suppression of dissent. Economic intelligence informing trade negotiations and business strategies. The aggregate value of this stolen information, measured in both security and economic terms, likely represents billions of dollars and significant strategic advantages. From an intelligence operations perspective, campaigns like those conducted by Elderwood represent relatively low-risk, high-reward activities. The chances of direct consequences for conducting cyber-espionage are minimal. No Chinese officials have been prosecuted successfully for Aurora or related operations. International law regarding cyber-espionage remains underdeveloped. The most severe consequences China faced were diplomatic protests and stronger cybersecurity defenses by potential victims, costs that were probably deemed acceptable given the intelligence gains. This risk-reward calculus helps explain why Elderwood and similar groups could operate persistently over many years. From the Chinese government's perspective, if such operations even exist officially, the potential intelligence value justified the diplomatic costs and the risk of exposure. As long as the benefits exceeded the costs, there was little reason to stop. This has implications for deterrence and international norms around cyber operations, questions that the international community continues to grapple with. Part 15: Aurora's place in cyber history and modern implications. More than a decade after Operation Aurora, the incident remains one of the most significant cyber attacks in history, a watershed moment that changed how we think about cybersecurity, technology company operations in authoritarian countries, and the nature of 21st-century geopolitical conflict. Understanding Aurora's place in the broader history of cyber operations helps illuminate both how far we've come and how many of Aurora's lessons remain relevant today. Before Aurora, major cyber incidents were relatively rare in public consciousness. The I Love You virus in 2000 had caused widespread damage, but was the work of individual hackers, not state actors. The Estonia cyber attacks in 2007 had garnered attention for being attributed to Russian actors, but they were denial-of-service attacks that disrupted services rather than stealing data. Titan Rain, a series of intrusions attributed to China in the mid-2000s, primarily targeted government networks and received less public attention. Aurora was different. A sophisticated espionage campaign against private corporations, publicly disclosed by victims, with clear evidence of state sponsorship and significant diplomatic consequences. Aurora established several precedents that would influence subsequent cyber operations and responses. It was one of the first times a major corporation publicly attributed a cyber attack to a nation-state and made business decisions based on that attribution. Google's willingness to walk away from the Chinese market rather than continue operating under those conditions set an example, though one that few other companies would follow. The incident demonstrated that private companies could become geopolitical actors, inserting themselves into international relations in ways that were primarily the domain of governments. The incident also established zero-day exploits as a common feature of sophisticated cyber operations. While zero days had been used before, Aurora brought them to public attention in a major way. The realization that attackers were sitting on stockpiles of unknown vulnerabilities in widely used software changed the threat landscape. It drove vulnerability research both for defensive and offensive purposes. It raised policy questions about whether governments should disclose vulnerabilities they discovered or keep them secret for intelligence and military purposes. Aurora was part of what came to be recognized as the APT threat model. Advanced persistent threats, sophisticated actors willing to invest time and resources into compromising specific targets and maintaining long-term access for intelligence collection. The security industry had to evolve to address APT threats differently from opportunistic cybercrime. Different defensive strategies, different detection approaches, different response priorities. Aurora was a catalyst for this evolution. The techniques used in Aurora have become standard components of modern cyber operations. Spear phishing remains one of the most effective methods for gaining initial access to target networks. Exploitation of zero-day vulnerabilities continues to be valuable for bypassing defenses. Lateral movement through networks after initial compromise is standard tradecraft. Targeting of source code repositories and intellectual property remains a priority for espionage operations. In this sense, Aurora was ahead of its time, showcasing techniques that would become increasingly common. However, defenses have also evolved substantially since Aurora. The zero-trust security architecture that Aurora helped inspire has become mainstream. Major technology companies have implemented sophisticated security operations that would detect many of Aurora's techniques more quickly today. Multi-factor authentication has become standard, making credential theft less useful. Endpoint detection and response tools provide visibility that didn't exist in 2009. While sophisticated attackers continue to succeed, they face a much more challenging defensive environment than Elderwood encountered in 2009. The geopolitical dimension of Aurora has become even more relevant over time. In 2009, the idea that cyber operations could be a major component of great power competition was still emerging. Today, it's taken for granted. The United States and China are engaged in sustained cyber competition involving espionage, intellectual property theft, and preparation for potential future conflict. Russia has conducted increasingly aggressive cyber operations against Ukraine and Western nations. North Korea has used cyber attacks for both intelligence and financial gain. Cyber operations are now a standard tool of statecraft. The specific issue that triggered Google's exit from China, surveillance of human rights activists, has only intensified in the years since Aurora. China has built increasingly sophisticated domestic surveillance systems. The treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang has involved comprehensive digital surveillance. Hong Kong's freedoms have been systematically dismantled, with technology playing a role in identifying and suppressing dissidents. The concerns that Google expressed in 2010 about being complicit in human rights violations through providing services in China have proven prescient. The broader question of how technology companies should navigate operations in authoritarian countries remains unresolved. Most major tech companies still try to operate in China, though increasingly on China's terms. Apple stores iCloud data for Chinese users on servers in China controlled by a Chinese state-owned company. LinkedIn opened a Chinese version that complied with censorship requirements, though they eventually shut it down. ByteDance, the Chinese company that owns TikTok, faces scrutiny in the United States about data security and content manipulation. The tension between market access and values that Google grappled with in Aurora continues to play out across the industry. Aurora also foreshadowed the rise of China as a technology power independent of Western companies. In 2009, Chinese tech companies were often viewed as copycats, imitating Western innovations. Today, companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, and ByteDance are global competitors with genuine innovation. Whether source code stolen in operations like Aurora contributed to this rise is debated. What's clear is that China's technology sector has developed dramatically, often with government support, sometimes using questionable means of technology acquisition. The incident raised questions about software and hardware supply chain security that have become even more critical. If Chinese actors could steal source code from technology companies, could they insert backdoors into products manufactured in China? These concerns have driven policies like restrictions on Huawei telecommunications equipment in Western networks, bans on Chinese-made security cameras in government facilities, and requirements for technology supply chain audits. The trusted relationship between global technology suppliers and customers, never perfect, has become even more fraught. From a security industry perspective, Aurora was a catalyst for enormous growth and evolution. The global cybersecurity market has expanded from roughly $20 billion in 2010 to well over $150 billion today. New categories of security products have emerged. Security operations have become more sophisticated. The profession of cybersecurity has grown from a relatively niche field to a critical discipline with labor shortages and competitive salaries. While Aurora wasn't solely responsible for this growth, it was a major contributing factor in raising awareness about cyber threats. For policymakers, Aurora demonstrated the challenges of deterrence and attribution in cyberspace. Traditional deterrence relies on credible threats of retaliation. But how do you retaliate against cyber-espionage that, while harmful to commercial interests, doesn't rise to the level of an armed attack? How do you establish norms of behavior in cyberspace when major powers have different views on what's acceptable? These questions remain largely unresolved. Various attempts at cyber norms through United Nations processes have made limited progress. The Budapest Convention on Cybercrime provides some international legal framework, but doesn't address nation-state espionage. The U.S. government's response to Aurora and similar incidents has evolved over time. In 2014, the Justice Department indicted 5 Chinese military officers for cyber-espionage against U.S. companies. While these individuals will likely never face trial, the indictments represented a willingness to publicly call out Chinese cyber operations. In 2015, the United States and China reached an agreement that both countries would refrain from conducting or supporting cyber theft of intellectual property for commercial advantage. Skepticism about Chinese compliance with this agreement remains high, but it represents an attempt at establishing norms. The legal and regulatory environment for cybersecurity has evolved significantly since Aurora, though not always in ways directly traceable to that incident. Data breach notification requirements have expanded. Industry-specific regulations like HIPAA for healthcare and financial services regulations include cybersecurity requirements. The European Union's GDPR established strict requirements for protecting personal data. In the United States, various sector-specific regulations and state laws create a patchwork of cybersecurity requirements. While Aurora involved intellectual property theft rather than personal data breaches, it contributed to momentum for stronger cybersecurity regulation. For individual users, Aurora reinforced lessons about the importance of security awareness. The spear phishing techniques that enabled Aurora's initial access remain effective today. Users need to be cautious about clicking links, downloading attachments, and providing credentials even when messages appear legitimate. Software needs to be kept updated to patch vulnerabilities. Multi-factor authentication should be enabled where available. These basic security hygiene practices, while not foolproof, make successful attacks more difficult. The incident also highlighted the interconnected nature of security in the modern digital ecosystem. A vulnerability in one product like Internet Explorer could be exploited to compromise systems at dozens of organizations. Compromised hosting infrastructure at one provider could support attacks against many victims. Stolen source code could potentially affect millions of end users of the software. Security is not just an individual or organizational concern, but a collective challenge requiring cooperation and information sharing. Looking forward, many of the trends that Aurora exemplified continue to accelerate. Nation-state cyber operations are becoming more aggressive and more frequent. Ransomware attacks have added a criminal dimension to cyber threats that didn't exist at Aurora's scale. Supply chain attacks, where adversaries compromise software vendors to reach their ultimate targets, have become more sophisticated. The proliferation of Internet of Things devices has expanded the attack surface. Cloud computing has changed where data resides and how it's protected. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are being weaponized for both attack and defense. The fundamental tension that Aurora exposed between open, interconnected technology systems and security against sophisticated adversaries remains unresolved. The same features that make the Internet valuable for communication and commerce also create vulnerabilities. The same globalization that enables technology companies to operate worldwide also exposes them to diverse threats. The same innovation that drives economic growth also introduces new security risks. Balancing these competing interests is an ongoing challenge. Operation Aurora stands as a reminder that in the digital age, the most sophisticated attacks aren't always the loudest. No systems were destroyed. No visible damage was done. But intellectual property was stolen, human rights activists were surveilled, and a major technology company was driven out of the world's largest market. The attack's sophistication lay not in dramatic explosions or obvious destruction, but in quiet, persistent intelligence collection that went undetected for weeks. It's this type of threat, patient, sophisticated, well-resourced, that remains among the most challenging to defend against. For students of cybersecurity, Aurora provides a case study in nearly every aspect of the discipline: social engineering and spear phishing, vulnerability exploitation, malware analysis, network security, incident response, threat intelligence, attribution, policy and international relations, legal and regulatory implications. The incident touches on all of these areas, making it enduringly relevant for understanding the multifaceted nature of cyber threats. More than a decade later, we're still living with Aurora's legacy. The zero-trust security architecture it helped inspire is still being implemented. The geopolitical tensions it highlighted have intensified. The threat actor behind it, or their successors, presumably continue operations. The fundamental questions it raised about technology, security, human rights, and international relations remain pressing. Aurora was a turning point, a moment when the comfortable assumptions about cybersecurity and global technology operations were shattered. We're still picking up the pieces and trying to build something more resilient. So what do we take away from Operation Aurora, this sprawling saga of cyber-espionage, corporate courage, geopolitical maneuvering, and technological evolution? What lessons remain relevant today as we navigate an increasingly hostile digital landscape? First, and most fundamental, perfect security doesn't exist. Google in 2009 was one of the most sophisticated technology companies in the world, with excellent security capabilities and significant resources to defend themselves. They were still compromised. This isn't a failure unique to Google. It's the reality of defending against determined, well-resourced adversaries who only need to succeed once, while defenders need to succeed every time. The goal isn't perfect security but rather resilience, the ability to detect and respond to incidents when they inevitably occur. Second, the human element remains critical in both attack and defense. Aurora succeeded initially not because of some brilliant technical exploit that bypassed all defenses, but because people clicked on convincing phishing emails. The most sophisticated security technology in the world can be undermined by a single employee who doesn't recognize a social engineering attack. This isn't about blaming individuals, but about recognizing that security requires both technical controls and human awareness working together. Third, intellectual property is a priority target for nation-state cyber operations, and companies need to protect it accordingly. Source code, research data, proprietary processes, these assets represent enormous value and are actively targeted. Yet many organizations still don't protect intellectual property with the same rigor they protect customer credit card data. Understanding what your crown jewels are and ensuring they receive appropriate protection is fundamental. Fourth, zero-day vulnerabilities are a permanent feature of the threat landscape. There will always be unknown vulnerabilities in software, and sophisticated attackers will always have exploits for at least some of them. This reality drives both the need for strong vulnerability management programs and the recognition that security must work in depth, with multiple layers that can compensate when one layer fails. Fifth, the castle and moat security model is fundamentally inadequate against modern threats. Assuming that everything inside your network perimeter is trusted means that once attackers get past the perimeter, they have a relatively free run of your environment. Zero-trust architecture, where every access is verified regardless of origin, provides better protection against both external attackers and insider threats. Sixth, when major security incidents occur, transparency and information sharing benefit the broader community. Google's decision to go public about Aurora, while risky for the company, helped other organizations understand they might be at risk and take defensive measures. The security community's collaborative analysis of Hydrack and the attack techniques spread defensive knowledge widely. Security through obscurity doesn't work. Security through shared knowledge and collective defense does. Seventh, attribution matters, but is difficult. Understanding who is behind attacks helps inform defensive strategies, shape policy responses, and enables appropriate retaliation or deterrence. But attribution in cyberspace is technically challenging and politically sensitive. The evidence in Aurora was stronger than in most cases, yet still fell short of courtroom-quality proof. Building better attribution capabilities remains a priority for both technical and policy communities. Eighth, values matter in business decisions, even when they're expensive. Google's decision to exit China rather than continue operating under conditions that compromise their principles and endangered users cost the company access to an enormous market. But it also preserved the company's credibility and integrity. Not every company will make the same choice Google did, but the question of where to draw lines around acceptable compromises in authoritarian markets remains relevant for any global technology company. Ninth, cybersecurity is not just a technical problem, but a business, policy, and geopolitical challenge. Operation Aurora touched on all of these dimensions. Responding effectively required not just technical expertise, but also business strategy, legal analysis, policy consideration, and diplomatic engagement. Modern cyber threats demand multidisciplinary responses. 10th, the evolution of threats requires continuous evolution of defenses. The techniques that worked for Elderwood in Aurora have been countered by improved defenses, so sophisticated attackers have developed new techniques. This cycle will continue. Security is not a destination, but a continuous process of adaptation and improvement. Organizations that think they can solve security and move on are setting themselves up for compromise. Finally, in an interconnected world, everyone's security affects everyone else's. Aurora exploited vulnerabilities in Internet Explorer, a Microsoft product, to compromise Google and dozens of other companies. The hosting infrastructure of Rackspace was used to support attacks against Rackspace customers. Source code stolen from one company could potentially be used to attack users of that company's products. We share a common digital ecosystem, and security in that ecosystem requires cooperation, information sharing, and collective action. Operation Aurora was a wake-up call that we're still responding to. It revealed that the digital systems we rely on are more vulnerable than we'd like to believe. It demonstrated that nation-states were willing to conduct aggressive cyber operations against private companies. It showed that the global technology ecosystem creates shared risks and shared responsibilities. It forced us to rethink fundamental assumptions about how to defend networks, how to protect intellectual property, and how to navigate the geopolitical dimensions of technology operations. As you navigate the digital world, whether as a technology professional, a policymaker, a business leader, or simply someone who uses the internet, the lessons of Aurora remain relevant. Be skeptical of unsolicited messages even when they seem legitimate. Keep your software updated. Understand that sophisticated adversaries exist and might target you even if you're not obviously important. Recognize that security is everyone's responsibility, not just something the IT department handles. The story of Operation Aurora is ultimately a story about adaptation and resilience in the face of sophisticated threats. The attackers adapted their techniques to bypass defenses. Google adapted their security architecture and their business strategy in response to the attack. The security industry adapted with new products, new services, and new approaches. This continuous adaptation, this ongoing evolution in response to changing threats, is what cybersecurity is about. If you found this deep dive into Operation Aurora interesting and informative, consider hitting that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more in-depth explorations of the hacks, breaches, and cyber operations that have shaped our digital world. The intersection of technology, security, and geopolitics provides endless fascinating stories, and there's always more to explore. Share your thoughts in the comments. What surprised you most about Aurora? What questions do you still have? And what other cyber incidents would you like to see covered in depth? Remember, the digital world offers incredible opportunities for communication, commerce, innovation, and progress. But it also contains real threats from sophisticated adversaries pursuing intelligence, economic advantage, and strategic goals. Understanding incidents like Operation Aurora helps us navigate that world with appropriate awareness and preparation. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay secure.